Good morning and welcome. We are so excited to see everyone here today, and welcome to the Misinformation, Mistrust, COVID-19 Conversations on Race and Gender. My name is Nadine Barrett. I am faculty in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health, and I'm really excited to highlight a key part of this work that we're doing today, or this conversation, if you will, specifically as it relates to the partnership between our broad community that has incredible expertise as we think about race, gender, equity, and conversation mistrust, and also highlighting the partnership between the Clinical Translation Science Institute, led by Dr. Ebony Boulware, in which I serve as Associate Director of Community and Stakeholder Strategy and Equity, and of course with the Social Science Research Institute, which my dear colleague Don Taylor leads, and he'll be sharing some words momentarily. The timing for this session is so important as we are sitting in the middle of this pandemic of COVID-19, and most certainly as we think about the work that we did in a previous symposium that we specifically focused on COVID-19 and health disparities just several months ago. This is part 2 of that series, and we hope that this conversation will continue as we work through both COVID-19, but even beyond that. What are the things that we need to be talking about, learning from each other and learning from the experts that come from our community and the experts across to be able to make the kind of difference that we need to make, ultimately toward improving health outcomes for everyone within the context of COVID-19 and beyond. So I'm really excited and thrilled again about this day. We're excited about this ongoing partnership with CTSI and SSRI, and really looking forward to hearing the wealth of expertise that's going to come from our panelists in the sessions today. I'll pass it on now to my colleague and partner and friend, Dr. Don Taylor, as I said, leader of Social Science Research Institute, to take it from here. And again, welcome. We're really excited to be a part of this important conversation that needs to happen and should continue. Don?
Thank you. And first, I would just like to say welcome. My name is Don Taylor. I'm a professor of public policy in the Sanford School, and I direct the Social Science Research Institute. I especially want to thank Amy Barbie and Cedric Allen, Matt Harker, and Pam Maxon. Those are the colleagues between SSRI and CTSI who have worked so hard behind the scenes to make this possible. So thank you so much to them. This topic, misinformation and mistrust, often universities or the medical profession thinks about misinformation or mistrust in a sense of saying, how could folks not believe what we're telling them? And one of the things we know that we need to do and that we want to model today is we need to ask, what is it that we have done in the past, and what is it that we are not doing today that leads people to plausibly not trust us? And that's a subtle but important distinction. And I'm hopeful that today we're going to provide some great information. I know we are in the keynote session. Professor Julius Wilder, MD, PhD in sociology, a liver transplant expert, Jay Pearson, and then Vashti Johnson. They're all going to bring their perspectives. And then after that, we're going to transition into 2 sessions where we're going to see conversations with folks from all across Duke and the Durham community. And so I just want to say thank you, and I'm excited. And also, I forgot to thank Alexandra Glenn and Courtney Orning. Those are also folks who helped put this together. My goodness, as a faculty member, I realized that if all the staff somehow just disappeared, Duke would grind to a halt. If all the faculty just disappeared, I guess we wouldn't have classes for a bit, but the business of the university would actually carry on for a little while. So we faculty often forget that. So thank you, everyone.
Excellent.
So now I think we're actually shockingly ahead of time. But might as well go with that. So Dr. Wilder is going to present now what we know and don't know about the unequal health effects of COVID-19. So Professor Wilder.
Great, thank you very much, Don. I'm just going to share my screen here. And thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak. This is a very special event. The idea of engaging the population on this is, particularly our community, is really important. And what I'd like to do with this is to spend some time sort of speaking to precisely what Don was talking about, because I've seen this sort of pattern where folks don't necessarily believe precisely what we're seeing. And so the objectives today, first I'd like to talk about that disproportionate burden of COVID-19. We'll look at it at a global, national, and we'll kind of narrow it down actually even down to Durham County to see what we're seeing here so we can really understand what this disease is doing and how it particularly has impacted people of color. But then I want to take a step back and do something that we don't do often, which is to explore how it affects health in different health areas or systems, systems that are particularly relevant to communities of color. And then steps, and I'll hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Pearson, after that. So the first piece of this is sort of to understand how quickly this has developed. And that is why this has been such an unbelievable impact in terms of the pandemic itself. Back in late December 31st, in fact, is when China first alerted WHO about this new pneumonia with an unknown cause in Wuhan. Very shortly thereafter that, we had the first confirmed case outside of China. Then we had the first confirmed death outside of China, and it kind of went on and on and on to a point where now they actually ended up declaring, of course, the pandemic in April. And so by that time, we had about 1 million cases worldwide, which quickly then grew to 4 million cases by May. And you can see here in this pandemic timeline how quickly it's grown, including the United States, of course. We came on about the same time as Europe, but of course we grew it exponentially at that point, and now we're kind of leading the world in terms of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. But I'm going to ask everyone to please. I can hear something beep, and if you have your computer not on mute, please go ahead and put your computer on mute. But I wanted to show this slide because a colleague of mine said exactly what Don said. They said that they didn't think this was real. They thought it was a hoax. They didn't really appreciate, because how significant this was, because they didn't have none of their family members had been sick or friends. They didn't know anyone that died. And so, I think it's important to kind of put things into context. And in here, I want to use the historical context. We're in this for about 4 years, and World War II for about the same amount of time. And you can see we had 600 and 400,000 deaths. We were in World War I for about a year and a half, and we had 116,000 deaths. We've been in this pandemic for about, I guess, going on about 6 or so months now, and we already have 7 million cases. We have 408,000 hospitalizations, currently 31,000 hospitalized, and that's now well over 200,000 deaths, with almost 3 million recovered. And so in terms of our understanding of the burden and the severity of this disease, even if you don't know anyone specifically that's had it, I promise you it's very, very real. And let's take a look at some of that data. So if you take a step back and look at the United States, generally speaking, this is the most up-to-date data. If you look at daily tests, cases, currently hospitalized, and daily deaths, you can see the trend over time. We've had a couple of peaks. The peak that we're all very familiar with would have been when we were first going into our quarantine in the late spring. You can see a second peak, even greater, occurring later in July and early August. That peak being very evident with respect to cases, hospitalizations, and daily deaths. If we narrow down a little bit more, we can look at our region. Now, we're in the South, and we're proud Southerners. We make up a good population of the United States, but we also make up a large bit of people who've had COVID-19. Here you are looking at regional daily cases with most recent up-to-date data from September 30th. You can see, again, similar trends with respect to the peaks in spring and then later summer, and kind of where we are at right now. In fact, on September 30th, the South, where we are sitting right now, had about 19,000 daily cases, and we represented 44% of daily cases on that day. That was cases, this is deaths. And unfortunately, we see the same trend. Now, remember, the Northeast, you see that early peak because that was New York, okay? And the rest of the country began to rise around that time, but most of our peaks really occurred later. And again, here in the South, you see on September 30th, we accounted for half the daily deaths that occurred for COVID-19 in the United States. And so where we are is a place where there have been a number of cases and deaths. And if we come a little bit narrower and look at North Carolina specifically, we can see a similar trend where our state has followed that same trend with respect to tests, cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Okay, and what I would draw your attention to is that deaths, you can kind of see things begin to kind of tick back up. And similarly, you can see the same thing with hospitalizations and cases. This is important because we are entering a season where we're not totally aware of what's going to happen with respect to how this disease is going to behave. Will there be another wave of severe disease? Now, if we get a little narrower and look at our state, and this is actually from our state website, you can look at positivity. So we're sitting at about 4% positivity rate in Durham, which I'm going to take a chance. I think this is Durham right here. I could be wrong. Y'all can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's Durham right there. And we're in about the 46% range. And you can see the trend here with respect to deaths as well. North Carolina overall has done well, but I will tell you that if you look at the United States as a whole, they measure hotspots, and they're based off the number of cases, the positivity rate, the change in cases, and the change in positivity rate, and the total number of active cases and hospitalizations. Using that data, North Carolina technically actually is a hotspot. I think a lot of that is driven by the fact that we have counties where you can see here where the positivity is at sort of the 10 to 15% range. Now, that was sort of a discussion on sort of the overall national data, right, generally speaking. But the really important piece to this is the fact that this has been a disproportionate burden, right? There was all this talk in the media about this being a colorblind disease. It's not. COVID-19 is as racist and leverages structural racism as well as any other disease we've ever seen. In fact, you could argue better than any other disease we've ever seen. One of the first signals of that was here when they were looking at initial rates in New York back in March when they had those really, really high peaks. What they saw was that if they looked at the zip code, you saw this clear sort of segregation in terms of the burden of disease. And that segregation with respect to the segregation of COVID-19 correlated with residential segregation with respect to race and socioeconomic status. So the first signal was here around here when we began to sort of say, this is interesting, it's really manifesting differently. Is it, and why is that? And so when we take a step back and sort of look at our country as a whole, we see that it wasn't just New York. This was absolutely relevant and prevalent across the entire country. And so here, what you're looking at is a map of the United States and different colors. And the darker color, the browns, indicates states where either the deaths or cases in African Americans is higher than expected. And that expectation is based on the overall population, okay? And so what you see that is in most states, African Americans actually have more deaths and more cases than expected, given their overall makeup of that population in that state. And in fact, North Carolina, you can see with respect to both deaths and cases, that is the case. And if we look at that trend in Blacks over time, again, you can see more cases, right, than to deaths than proportional, that has maintained well above the expected amount, right? So again, that's scary considering the fact that we don't have a cure yet, we don't have a vaccine yet, and we're heading into a season where it may come back, okay? But this was not just manifested in African Americans. Hispanics and Latinos had similar findings. Again, if you look at deaths and cases, in scenarios where they are represented above what you would expect given their relative representation in the population, you can see that, again, there are more deaths and cases expected than you would expect in Hispanic and Latino populations. And I would draw your attention once again to our community. Again, you see both for Hispanic and Latinos, deaths and cases are higher than expected. And, when I look at Hispanic and Latino data, I actually look at it assuming that it's probably worse than it looks, meaning we don't do a very good job of accurately capturing data in those populations, and therefore we're probably underestimating the true burden of the disease in those communities. But the trend was a little different in terms of how it behaved. It started a little bit lower back in May, but very quickly caught up with respect to cases and have caught up as well with respect to deaths with a slight uptick. And so we'll have to be watching this in that population as well as we move forward into the winter. And then here, you know, speaking of populations that we don't really capture data very well, our Native American population, also a group that's been significantly disproportionately affected by this disease. Again, this is the same data for them. You can see the states where they are in terms of deaths and cases being affected more than to be expected. And I would draw your attention once again to North Carolina being one of those states. And again, this is a population that we're probably underestimating in terms of the true burden of the disease. And you can see the trend here as well for them, where again, the overall cases and deaths have gone up and have remained above a level that we would be expected. So this is the cumulative US COVID-19 death by race in the disease since April. There have been a lot of lives lost. And the question begins, you know, how do we begin to address and think about this, right? I mean, we're talking about Blacks dying at a rate 3.4 times that of whites, as well as Latino and indigenous populations. Literally, if Blacks died at the same rate as whites, we probably would have saved around 25 to 30,000 lives. If Latinos did probably around 5 to 10,000 lives, and about 1 to 3,000 lives if indigenous populations died at the same rate as whites. And so these are lives lost. Dr. Pearson will get into the mechanisms behind this, but this is important data to recognize. This is a very real thing that's killed, unfortunately, so many lives, and we have to begin to think about how we're going to address this. Now, there's been a lot of controversy around deaths in hospital. We've had studies that go back and forth in terms of whether or not there really are a difference or a disparity among patients who are hospitalized. I think it's somewhat of a silly argument, honestly, because we don't have a cure yet. And so what we're just looking at is how people respond and how we can manage this disease. But this study from the Kaiser Foundation actually did show that there were disparities with respect to hospitalization and death rates. In fact, when they looked at the probability of experiencing hospitalization or death compared to white patients with similar sociodemographic characteristics and underlying health conditions, you can see the rates of death here, including these disparities, particularly among Hispanic and Asian populations. And so we need to begin to think about its burden and how we're going to address this issue. Now, what we've talked about oftentimes with COVID-19 is cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, and its disproportionate burden, absolutely. But there's also the interaction of COVID-19 with other health issues that we know are important, particularly in communities of color. And so let me just take a step back. We talk about this. So what is COVID-19? First of all, the virus, okay? And so it is a respiratory virus. It really spreads through droplets, primarily coughing, sneezing. It can live inside the droplet and be transmitted, particularly if you touch a surface where it's still active. People can spread it if you are infected, but you're not having symptoms. Symptoms typically occur about 5 days after exposure, and can, about pretty much people who are going to have them within 12 days. That's part of the reason why we have the 14-day quarantine. We have good means of diagnosing it. It can get into your throat and cause cough. It can really cause a severe pneumonia if it gets into your lungs. About 1 in 20 patients with COVID-19 will die. And we just saw a lot of death data, particularly with respect to its burden on people of color. And there is no definitive cure or vaccine for it. We think steroids may help the most severely ill people. That's sort of managing the symptoms, not really treating or curing the disease. Okay, and so really what we're left with is trying to reduce transmission. And that's why face masks are so important. Physical distancing is so important, and frequent hand washing as well is really, really important. Now, I want to stop here and sort of take a step back and talk about what it is, so that you can have an idea about what this virus is. Now I want to take a step forward and think about, what is it doing in people and why is it driving these outcomes? And so we know that people who have certain comorbidities and get COVID-19 have worse outcomes. And that probably is partly contributing to the disparities that we're seeing. So if you have diabetes or hypertension, obesity, coronary artery disease, or chronic kidney disease, you may have a worse outcome if you get COVID-19, okay? And the reason why that's thought to explain disparities that we just talked about is because people of color often are disproportionately affected by these same comorbidities. But, biological mechanisms aren't always just biology. And so the very comorbid conditions that we use to explain the disparities of COVID-19 are really occurring as a result of the same social determinants that we think are contributing to COVID-19 in the first place. And so you have this sort of vicious cycle where the comorbidities and the disease that modulates them are working together through the same social determinants to increase morbidity and mortality in people of color. And then let's go to look at some of the specific organ systems around it, because I think there's a lot of questions about this, particularly if you're a person in the community who has liver disease, for instance. With respect to people who have liver disease or GI disease, it does cause an increase of liver enzymes, and that can be associated with worse outcomes in people with liver disease, particularly people who have the most advanced form of liver disease or cirrhosis. They have a higher mortality risk than a person who just has COVID-19. And there can also be symptoms in the GI tract. We can have anorexia, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. We think this occurs because of a receptor that COVID-19 binds that's found in your liver as well as in your colon. And it binds that receptor and results in these outcomes in that organ. That's what we know. What we don't know is what that means long term. What does it mean to people who already have liver disease? How much scar does it cause in the liver? And what sort of GI symptoms down the road can be associated with this? These are some questions that we're going to have to answer over time. What about the heart? So again, I was talking about the same receptor in the GI and hepatology area. Well, this is the same thing in the heart. It binds that receptor. And in the heart, it behaves a little different. So it binds this receptor that's also found in numerous vessels in your body. And when it does that, it creates this sort of environment where you can have vascular injury and the creation of thrombosis or clots. And those clots can form in the arteries or in the veins. And then if you get really, really sick with COVID-19, you can have this sort of really severe inflammatory response that also can contribute to clots. And so this thrombosis is a really important issue that you may have heard of that can be a particularly dangerous outcome. And this is via the heart or cardiac pathway that it causes that. But it also acts directly on the heart by causing a very sort of strange inflammation. And instead of doing so, it makes your cardiac markers or your cardiac enzymes, your heart labs, go high, almost like you're having a heart attack. Although you're not having a heart attack, it's just the virus causing this inflammatory response or myocarditis. And so if you have that, there's actually a pretty high risk of inpatient mortality. But again, we know these are the things that can occur when it comes to the cardiovascular system. But what we don't understand is the long-term effects. If you do have this occur in your heart and you have some heart failure that's often mild, what does that mean long-term to your risk of having heart failure or heart attacks or even heart arrhythmias down the line? And again, I'm hitting on sort of organ systems that I know are important with respect to communities of color as well. So we talked about GI and liver, because particularly cirrhosis is more predominant in communities of color. We talked about heart disease, of course. We know that plays out a lot in communities of color. And here we're talking about kidney disease. So patients with kidney disease are very vulnerable to SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. Acute kidney injury occurs at a much higher rate, interesting enough, in the United States than what we saw in China. We think this might be related to the fact that we have more chronic kidney disease here, primarily due to the burden of that disease, chronic kidney disease, in people of color. Why? We don't really know the underlying mechanism. We believe it's acute tubular necrosis, but it's likely a multifactorial process where a number of entities are coming together in the setting of having COVID-19 that's stressing your kidneys and resulting in your kidneys not working as well. And then an interesting manifestation that you may have heard about in the media is this idea of COVID-19 toes. And it's really sort of a bizarre finding because, children often will have rashes when they have a illness, but it's extremely rare for adults to have legit rashes when they have a viral illness. But there's one study that quoted as high as 20% prevalence of this rash or viral exanthems in adults who have COVID-19. And this is what it looks like. They call it an acral Chilblains-like lesion. Interestingly enough, when you look at, there's no sort of recorded documentation of this occurring in people of color. We don't know if that's because we just don't know how to recognize it in people of color. That's actually a very common problem in dermatology, and that's actually recently gotten a lot of attention. But to this point, it's not really describing people of color at this point. I suspect probably it does occur. We just aren't really recognizing it. And then I want to sort of end this section with pediatrics. Particularly with our children, looking at going back to school here soon, less than 6% of the COVID cases have occurred in children. Most of those were minor. We think that is because that same receptor I was talking about, the ACE2, appears to be age dependent in terms of expression, meaning there's less of it present in your nasal pathways if you're younger. And so we think that might be protective in terms of likelihood of children actually contracting the disease. That having been said, you may have heard in the media about this sort of multi-system inflammatory syndrome that's very, very severe. It mimics what we call this sort of Kawasaki disease or toxic shock syndrome. And what that really is these children, when they get really, really sick with this inflammatory syndrome, they have severe cardiac effects, they have arrhythmias, they have heart failure, they have sort of inflammatory response of the cardiac tissue. They can get severe fevers, diarrhea. They can have sort of organ shutdown and shock. Thankfully, if this does occur, they do respond fairly well to steroids for treatment. But a scary thing that can occur. And I think one final thing with kids is sort of the psychological and educational well-being. You know, what does this mean to these children who've had to be quarantined, who've had their schooling delayed, particularly children who may have special needs? We'll need to think about that moving forward and how we can sort of begin to address this. And this is on the right, a picture of a mental health organization from Greenville. They have this little poster they created about thinking about how to talk to kids and try to address some of the anxiety that they may have around COVID-19. I thought was pretty nice. So I'm going to end talking about a couple topics that I think are going to be important in the conversations we have moving forward today and even beyond about how we're going to address this pandemic, particularly in communities of color. You know, we are excited about the vaccines. They're not ready yet. We are moving very quickly. You know, people are very scared and don't really understand why we're moving so quickly. One of the main reasons we're moving very quickly on these viruses is because of a new technology that we have. This new technology allows for quicker development based off of mRNA, such that when we sequence the virus, only 66 days later, we were able to begin a clinical trial. And that was the Moderna and NIH trial. And then a second mRNA sequence was sequenced, and that actually is now in phase 3 in a partnership between BioNTech and Pfizer. So that's the new technology that's driving this sort of quick development of the vaccine. That's why it's moving so quickly. But of course, that's going to go through the normal sort of measures to ensure safety and efficacy. That having been said, we also have the sort of old-fashioned approach to trials, the inactivated vaccine that recently completed interim phase analyses from phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. That means that they tested it in healthy individuals, and the data looked great. They had a low rate of adverse reactions or bad reactions, and it demonstrated immunogenicity, meaning that vaccine was showing that you had the right response in your bloodstream, the antibodies that would protect you from COVID-19 if you were exposed. And so we're moving on the vaccines, and that's very exciting and really important and key to our ability to address the pandemic. But if we move on the vaccines and we don't think about how to address vaccine hesitancy, then we're going to fail. Less than half of U.S. adults received an influenza vaccine last year, and disparities persist. And you know, we're not talking about the anti-vaxxers. That's a very different conversation. We're talking about minority populations that understandably have a distrust of vaccination because of the legacy of things like Tuskegee and the relationship they have with the health system that are supposed to serve them. And we need to be thinking about how we can bridge that gap and engage our communities and work with you so that we can, A, work with you on clinical trials for our vaccines, and also work with you on how the best way to engage to ensure that people of color are comfortable engaging in vaccination. If we don't do that, we're not going to suppress enough of this virus within our communities to pandemic. And finally, there is the virus, but then there is the quarantine. And in the United States, we cannot disconnect what it means to have low socioeconomic status from. And the fact of the matter is that Black medium household income is 3/5 that of whites. They have significantly less wealth. If you look at even older households, you see tremendous difference in terms of Black and Latinx households. And so in the setting of having the steepest recession ever, the impact of this virus on us long-term in terms of health is going to be great. And it's not just that there was a steep recession, but it was a most disparate recession in that if you look at previous recessions in 1990, in 2001, and 2008, and that versus now, you see the big difference in terms of this disparity, such that the people who are more likely to get the disease because of probably the kind of work that they do, being frontline workers, were also the ones most likely to lose their jobs, lose their earnings. And so when we think about the immediate health impacts of this virus, that's one thing. But this right here tells us there are going to be long-term effects of this as well that we need to be thinking about in terms of policy to address. So I'll stop there and turn over to my colleague, Dr. Pearson, who will get into some of those fundamental causes and mechanisms that are driving these disparities. But our ability to defeat this pandemic will really depend on our ability and our willingness to fight and defeat the pandemic of social terms of health and racism. Failure to do so will mean further adverse health and economic consequences with this and subsequent pandemics, not just for people of color, but for every American. This is a communicable disease. It can't be an individualistic thing. We have to address the entire community if we want to keep all of us healthy and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilder, for that excellent opening session. You set me up very nicely for the information that I'm about to share as pertains to misinformation and mistrust among populations of color, but particularly among Black Americans, and the role of structural and systemic racism associated with mistrust, misinformation, and also the disproportionate burden of COVID-19 borne by populations of color, and again, particularly Black Americans. I'll start today by acknowledging that Duke University exists upon the historical lands of the forcibly displaced Sara, Saponi, and Shakur Native peoples of North Carolina, and upon the slave labor of forcibly removed West African Senegambia people and their descendants. So there was much early consternation over racialized disadvantage in COVID-19 impacts and outcomes across multiple indicators. More recent concern has been about the underrepresentation of populations of color, and particularly Black Americans, in clinical trials. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that these phenomena did not spring out of nothingness. There are very specific historical events and contemporary phenomenon that undergird these two outcomes. Racialized differences in health are long-standing and reliably patterned. For virtually every disease, disorder, and condition documented, Blacks and Indigenous, as well as other populations of color, are at significant risk for adverse health relative to whites. This patterning reflects the underlying social interactions characterizing racial dynamics in the US, and racialized differences in COVID-19 are simply the latest manifestation of these underlying phenomena. Multiple explanations for why these exist most focus on proximal individual risk factors. So to be clear, and lest we be confused today, the root fundamental cause of racialized health disadvantage in the US writ large are structural and systemic racism. Additionally, the racialized distribution of proximal individual risk is itself a function of structural and systemic racism. Moreover, the distribution of pre-existing conditions, that is comorbidities that exacerbate the impact of COVID-19, are also linked to minority racial status in a racist society. And finally, historical awareness and inertia associated with centuries of subjugation to a range of other racialized processes sponsors well-informed and justified mistrust of government, medical research, and medical care. Now, when we use the language of structural racism, as we know it in contemporary US society, structural racism is a set of social arrangements, relationships, and conditions that are systemically advantageous to majority population whites while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to minority populations of color. Structural racism holds that macro-level social processes associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias, are central organizing features of the nation that were established before its founding, that remain salient to the US social order until the present, and that these are multifaceted, interconnected, co-occurring phenomena. This means that structural racism is inextricably linked to US national identity. It pervades and suffuses virtually every major institution comprising US society and is consequently systemic. As such, it negatively impacts and determines the life chances and lived experiences of US-based populations of color to the benefit of white Americans, far beyond individual acts of interpersonal racial discrimination, which survey data suggest most people think of when we use the language of racism. So what we're talking about here are core values and the systems which reflect those core values. This is who we are. This is who we've been since before the inception of the nation, and current animated protest against overt dehumanizing racial injustice notwithstanding, who we are likely to continue being without similarly animated policy changes in our political, economic, educational, academic, policing, legal justice, and not least among these, public health and medical care systems. Race, as we know it in contemporary US society, is a social construct conceived of, developed, imposed, and perpetuated by Northwestern European immigrants to the emerging US. The race construct dehumanized the social other to justify material exploitation of Native Americans through appropriation of their historical lands, forced relocation, and economic exploitation of Black Africans through the institution of chattel slavery. So race is about stolen land, stolen labor, and stolen lives. Northwestern European immigrants to the emerging nation suggested that differences in desirable traits like intelligence, family values, and work ethic were inherently and systematically associated with one or some combination of phenotype, geographic origin, and ancestry. These same European immigrants argued that notions of these differences and characteristics implied a natural hierarchy of human populations, with themselves disproportionately displaying desirable traits and consequently worthy of occupying the pinnacle, that is, being at the top, while all populations of color and even some European populations disproportionately displayed undesirable traits and subsequently naturally occupied lower positions. Belief in and values associated with these notions of this natural system became normalized over time. And this normalization was institutionalized through public policy decision-making that effectively established and maintains a rigid stratified racial hierarchy of differential human valuation that uses one or some combination of what people look like, where they came from, or who we know their foremothers and forefathers to be as social markers for where people would be placed in these stratified hierarchies of differential human valuation. And present-day inequalities, including health inequalities and inequities between so-called racial groups, are not about natural biological differences, but instead the results of these historical and contemporary social, economic, educational, and political circumstances, reflecting how groups of people were and are differentially identified, socially ordered, and subsequently treated. The final dimension, social bias, constitutes this differential treatment. Positive racial bias manifests as supremacy and privilege that promote and advance the perspectives and interests of the white race, and negative racial bias manifests as oppression and discrimination that restrict and constrain the perspectives and interests of populations of color. And I'll come back to this construct of oppression and explain it in greater detail in about 5 slides, and which hopefully will help all of us understand exactly how this race thing, particularly this dimension of oppression, places populations of color, and particularly Black Americans, at a systemic disadvantage for COVID-19 and other negative health outcomes. These processes are systemic, meaning that we are dealing with sets of historical and contemporary organizing principles, that is, norms and values, as well as regular practices in the US that create, maintain, and perpetuate white supremacy while simultaneously oppressing populations of color. This reflects what we've come to think and believe about race, how that influences policy decision-making, which in turn informs development and maintenance of racially based institutions that foster and support interpersonal racial interactions, internalization of racist thought and action to the degree that they operate in unconscious ways. Think implicit associations, implicit bias. systemic racism can also be viewed as systems of race and race making that pervade, suffuse, and function across virtually every dimension of US society, operating at multiple levels of influence within it. And so I have a list here: legislative, educational, employment, residential segregation. And I'll explain in greater detail exactly how each of these is impacted by a history of racist policy decision-making. These systemic racist mechanisms establish and drive the conditions characterizing the lived social experiences of Black Americans, with the proximal risk associated with increased likelihood of COVID-19. Now, from a historical perspective, there's an inertia associated with race making and racial bias in the United States of America. And this graphic simply demonstrates the percentage of interactions between Black Americans in the US and the federal government that has been characterized by explicit state-sanctioned racial oppression. So fully 86% of the Black American experience in the United States of America has been under explicit racial oppression, again, government sanction, right? Only 14% since the Civil Rights Act of 1965 has been not under the direct government sanction imposition of racial oppression. But even then, the struggle for human recognition, human valuation, dignity, and respect continues. So let's return to this construct of racial oppression, which argues that it entails the construction of a social order wherein which members of a dominant group secure a disproportionate share of the good things in life, those desirable things, powerful roles, good housing, high quality education, good health, and members of subordinate groups receive a disproportionate share of the bad things in life, that is relatively poor housing, less high quality education, and the resultant poor health. And so we're talking about differential distributions of quality of life, social well-being and health enhancing resources, and quality of life, social well-being, and health compromising risk. Iris Marion Young argues that there are 5 dimensions of racial oppression: powerlessness, cultural imperialism, violence, and finally, and I'll focus on these 2 for the purposes of today's presentation, exploitation, which involves the appropriation of contributions of some populations by others, that is, social minorities are making contributions that the dominant group is benefiting from, and then marginalization, which is disqualification from the benefits that the minority group has disproportionately paid for. And so in terms of the Black American experience, Black Americans were exploited through unethical research, but unethical medical research, but marginalized through denial of equal medical services provision. So this means that those who paid a disproportionately high cost for medical advancements, Black Americans, receive a disproportionately low benefit of the services that have frequently been developed from that medical research. Think Tuskegee, forced sterilization, and extractive relationships with research institutions, including universities. The government has not just been complicit in these processes, but frequently actually supported and advanced these agendas. Black American awareness of this exploitation and marginalization sponsors a mistrust of these institutions that reduces the likelihood of participation in their efforts. So we're talking about medical research, medical care, and the federal government. So in conclusion, structural and systemic racism are indeed the fundamental root causes of the racialized social conditions that increase risk for COVID-19 exposure, infection, and impact for Black Americans, and profound, well-informed, and justified mistrust of institutions resulting from a history of exploitive and then marginalizing interactions between Black Americans medical institutions, research institutions, and the federal government results in reduced engagement with medical research. This concludes my portion of today's presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. I will now pass off to Ms. Vashti Johnson, who will share personal experiences with COVID-19.
Jay, I'm not sure. Hey, this is Don Taylor. I'm sorry I can't start my video, but we had expected Ms. Johnson, but I think something has come up.
Okay.
And so I thought, if you were willing, I have a question based on both your presentation and Julius's that I wanted to give you if I could ask you that question. Is that cool?
That is cool, Don. And I just got information that apparently my screen share didn't happen, but I'll go back to the beginning. But absolutely, Don, we can engage in.
About halfway through, we shared your slides. So sorry about that. So I'm wondering if we think of the FDA, has typically focused on the evidence out of clinical trials in approving vaccines. But I'm wondering if we should consider explicitly taking into account mistrust in the approval or non-approval, because my intuition is that if you had a vaccine that was 100% effective and only 30% of the population took it, it would be the same population level outcome as 100% of the population taking a 30% effective vaccine. So I wonder, we've always said stick to the science only, but I wonder if we don't have to start taking into account the science of what people think and do.
Yeah, no, Don, I think that is absolutely correct. And if what you are speaking to is social perception and the likelihood that we will see disproportionate uptake of whatever vaccine emerges, or differential uptake contingent upon social identity, absolutely. And so what that means is that those of us who are social scientists have a role to play in both the testing and the distribution of any treatments that are likely to emerge, and that we have to engage collaborations with our medical care colleagues and with our bent scientific or natural science colleagues, as well as community partners who are much closer to the phenomenon that we're interested in, that might restrict and constrain the likelihood of uptake or adoption of vaccines once they emerge. So yeah, absolutely.
And there's a question. I'm not sure if Professor Wilder can also come back on or not, but in the comments or in the Q&A, there's a question too saying, how can the FDA approve a vaccine when the populations that are most affected by the disease are not represented in this vaccine? And I think the short answer is that's what we've sort of always done, and that's always been an issue. But yeah,
that is the short answer, and that is the long answer. It's what is always, and it's well documented. It's how it's always operated. And the point that I made about these extractive relationships and who, in terms of exploitation, has disproportionately paid the cost, at least for some of this research. Certainly in gynecological research, and then being disproportionately denied access to the resource only exacerbates this phenomenon. And please understand that people are aware of this, or at least my folks are, my family is, right? And I assume that the broader population is also. Yeah. And I just saw Dr. Wilder is back.
Yeah, hey, how you doing? I'm sorry, yeah, that was a great question. And, it's funny, there has been in the past, question about how can you incentivize these things? There's a carrot and there's a stick, right? And so can the FDA incentivize appropriate vaccination clinical trials? So, you have a quicker route to approval if you are able to, on the front end, minimally your phase 1 and 2, but certainly your phase 3, be able to recruit a diverse population. This has been an issue, not just vaccinations, but in all sorts of diseases that disproportionately affect people of color as well, where the industry has just failed to to do this. And I think the reason why it persists is because of those fundamental issues that Dr. Pearson has spoken to, and quite frankly, an unwillingness of the FDA to be aggressive about the requirements about these things moving forward. Because you're right, Don. I mean, at baseline, we don't have enough vaccination for the flu. And so the idea of us being able to get what we need for a pandemic is tough to believe that's going to happen.
Yeah, there's for you two, there's a real direct question in the Q&A. It's someone saying, should a person of color sign up for a clinical trial or not? So I think that's I wonder what you think of. How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I don't know. I would definitely say yes. Now I will say, let me say that I do clinical trials, and so I have selfish reasons to want people of color. But the fact of the matter is that there are a number of examples where medications have been developed to treat diseases, and we were unaware of how ineffective they were, or potentially how dangerous they were in people of color, because we did not engage them appropriately in clinical trials. I think that there needs to be a conversation and better communication though with our community on the front end when developing these clinical trials, so that we structure them and that we communicate the clinical trial to the community in a way that folks are comfortable and know that it's going to be taking their best interests, of course, as a priority. But yeah, I would say definitely as a person of color, you should do clinical trials.
Yeah, I think, Jay, do you have a thought about that? Do you? Or...
Yeah, I have. And so I want to make a slightly different point, is that we talk about differences in terms of race and response to vaccines or other medications. I want to make sure that I make absolutely clear that we're not talking about inherent biological differences, but we're talking about biological response to differences in lived experience, right? So for instance, stress process, from being relegated to an inferior position in these stratified racial hierarchies, right, exacerbates, accelerates, and increases the likelihood of developing a broad range of chronic and degenerative conditions that have been found to be systematically associated with increased risk for the negative impact of COVID-19. Again, these are not about inherent biological differences, but biological responses to what people contend with in their daily lives and their lived experience. That's an important distinction. So
that's a very good point, Jay. I mean, what we're talking about here is the environment and how it interacts with you, and that can absolutely affect how diseases behave in people. And so, that's a very good point. And in fact, people have tried to make a genetic argument about COVID-19, right? Which is crazy. Similarly, it makes no sense. It's really what it is. Precisely what Jay's saying. It's the environment interaction, what it means. I mean, it's the occupation and where you live. I mean, that's what's driving what we're seeing here. It's not genetics.
So if I were going to restate very simply the question that I think you two just did a beautiful job of answering, it would be, and I've heard some form of this question asked to me by a neighbor a few weeks ago. Professor Taylor, if you say that race is primarily a socially constructed concept, why then does it matter if Black folk or people of color are in a clinical trial for a vaccine if there's not a biological issue? And the answer is because of the lived experience and the interaction of the environment with the disease. So that's the answer to that question. Is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, to Dr. Pearson's point he made earlier, there are very few examples where there is a genetic explanation. Maybe prostate cancer being one, but there are very limited examples where we have a definitive genetic explanation for these differences. And honestly, a lot of times they're claiming genetic differences and they haven't properly studied the genes to know what they're talking about in terms of race anyway. And so there are very few legit genetic, explanations that we're comfortable with in that respect.
There's a question in the Q&A about what has the state of North Carolina done and what should we be doing to promote good information to communities of color about COVID-19 and how to help them prepare for coming vaccines. I mean, what do you think? What can we do that's science-based at this point?
So, Don, that's a heavy question. Again, let me try to reframe the question. I'm not sure it's what we can do at this point. Perhaps the more compelling question is, what should we have already done in terms of reaching out and establishing the kind of relationships with our community partners, right, that foster trust? And quite frankly, it's not clear to me that we've done a good job of that. In fact, I read a document about 3 weeks ago, and I won't name the institution that that crafted this document, but it used the language of hard to reach populations. My interactions with folks who live in Durham and in North Carolina broadly suggest to me that it's not hard to reach populations, it's hardly reached populations. That is, that there hasn't been sufficient value and importance placed on forging those kinds of relationships, right? And creating relatively safe and equal environments and places at the table for all of us to engage in the kind of dialogue that would allow us to have entree into the communities where we could get some traction on this stuff.
Yeah, Don, I would say I would totally agree with Dr. Pearson on that. I think as we think about where we're headed in terms of the season and the potential for ongoing issues with COVID-19, we need to be thinking about how we can partner with the community to ensure appropriate testing, and not just tests, but like where's the best place to test? How do we manage contact tracing in populations that may have concerns about contact tracing? And then, certainly, again, I don't think there's enough attention being paid to, our working with the community to understand how this vaccination is going to work and how we're going to roll it out. And so I think doing that's going to be really important. There actually is data that shows that testing has not been done in the way that it should be in communities of color, and that we're way behind on that. And so that is an important thing to look at. But I think doing testing without understanding the role of vaccination, I think that is not going to put us in a good spot.
Yeah, I think one of my great takeaways from this pandemic is that we've used the phrase of essential worker, but that has not meant that we have paid folk like they were essential,
right,
or that we have given folk PPE or testing. And in particular, we have people who are probably fearful of getting tested if they don't have paid time off in their job. And then, that of course is very understandable from their perspective. But it's bad from a public health perspective. So I think in many ways, the pandemic, an infectious disease playing out as this one has, is perhaps the ultimate proof of these structural differences. And it's almost like we've seen 100 years play out in 100 days, COVID-19, which is, I don't know, it's just, that's sobering, I think. Let's see. A community member, there's a comment in the question, there's a question in the comments. A community member recently asked, when will large academic institutions start to trust the community? So we'd framed it as, when will folk trust us, and how do we earn trust? And even, so maybe, I wonder what you think about that. When will we trust the community? Or how will we trust the community?
Honestly, I think part of the issue with academic medical centers, and this is not a thing unique to Duke, this is, I think, academic medical centers everywhere, is it needs to be that needs to be something that is embraced by leadership at all levels. And so I think an important piece of that will be getting buy-in from leadership to understand that we will provide better care and be a better institution if we appropriately, partner with and trust our community. And so I think we need to do that. We certainly need to do a better job of that at Duke and everywhere, I think. But I think a key piece of that will be to ensuring that we have buy-in from leadership for that.
So I'd like to take a crack at that, Don, actually. And
Yeah,
so
please.
one of the things that I think happens in universities, certainly large research one type academic institutions, is, you know, we fashion ourselves experts, and frequently we fashion ourselves experts as a function of our education, that is what we learn, and our investigations, what we actually research. And, you know, I suspect that if we could conceive of expertise as emerging from actually having lived the phenomenon that we're interested in investigating, we would consider our community partners to have some expertise or some insight into their lives, their daily experiences, and what it is that they're contending with. That is, that they're much closer to the phenomenon and understand, you know, how to contend with it and what their motivations are for the actions associated with those than we are, right? And so if we could just expand, you know, our range of places that we consider expertise coming from, that might give us some traction also.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
No, so I mean, I think there are examples where, you know, entities, you know, within Duke, like SSRI and CTSI, have done great, you know, community-based participatory research where, you know, they have built those relationships and they've leveraged that expertise that exists in the community. And so I think, you know, and again, getting people in leadership to buy into leveraging those entities to maintain those inroads and grow those institutions and those groups within academic medical centers is a great way to kind of build that trust, you know, within the community and get the institutions to engage more and trust the communities more.
You know, I'm thinking, you know, we in a university tend to define scholars as people that have gone to school for way too long, like we all have. And maybe what we really need to do is define scholar as someone who's got a question to ask that's worth answering because it affects human beings. And, you know, maybe that's a thing that we need to try to do, you know, do more of. So you guys did an incredible job. Thank you so much. Jay, as always, so clear. Julius, I think that's the best overview of COVID-19 to have cases, mortality, and morbidity that I've seen. So,
Thank you.
You know, thank you so much. I know you you had a few other things to do in addition to this, and I realized this, you know, dug into your clinical care, but I appreciate it. So, so thank you, Professor Pearson and Professor Wilder. We're sorry we weren't able to hear from Ms. Johnson, and trust that she's okay. And so now we're going to transition our session, what we're calling our session number one. This is the end of our keynote session, is how can building trust in community relationships reduce the impact of COVID-19 misinformation? And Brian Southwell, my colleague from SSRI and RTI, is going to host that session. So stick with us, folks. Lots more good to come. Thank you very much.
Great. We'll give people just a moment or two for transition here, and then we'll get started.
Hey, Brian, appreciate you doing this. This is Don. Thank you so much.
Yep, no problem. Really looking forward to the conversation, and it fits very well with our opening session. So give people maybe just another 30 seconds to gather, get situated for what I'm really looking forward to is an important conversation. We've got a great panel together here. We really appreciate people volunteering their time for this. So,
yes, definitely.
Hey, Brian, this is Kendra. I can't start my camera.
Okay, no problem. We will remain flexible as we all needed to during this pandemic. So we can hear you loud and clear, Kendra.
Okay,
and,
now I can. Hold on.
And we're seeing you too.
Okay.
That's great. If the other folks that are joining us in this conversation here want to go ahead and attempt to start your cameras and unmute as well, that would be great.
This is Nia. I also can't start my camera.
Okay. We will see if we can work on that. Otherwise, we can hear you, Nia, which is great. And Pilar, we can see you as well. And let's see, we've got Constance and Linwood. Hello, good morning.
Morning.
And there's Nia. We can see you. Okay. We're hoping to be joined also by Fan Lee, and we'll give her just a second here. So we're a few minutes earlier than we originally were scheduled, and so she might be just a moment late. Great. And Kendra, you're coming through loud and clear, and we can see you as well too. So, okay. I think actually we can go ahead and get started on our conversation. And as folks join us here, we'll continue on with that. We want to thank everybody for joining us, not just the people that are on the screen right now, but all of you that are tuned in for this conversation. If you had an opportunity to listen to the last 10 or 15 minutes of our opening session, you would have heard underscored the need for serious thinking about community relationships, about community engagement. And we have just a tremendous panel here to talk about that in a serious way today. That said, it's, I think, the organizers' sincere hope and my sincere hope here that this is the beginning and a continuation of a conversation. We're not going to solve all of our problems here in 45 minutes together, but we are hopeful to make some connections and to put some ideas on the table as to how we can do a better job going forward. I think that this whole event is partly a recognition of the fact that Duke can do better. And we need to. And I think this is hopefully going to be an initial starting point in that longer term conversation. So we're here partly to talk about who we all turn to in moments of crisis, and who we turn to for information, and to learn from that a bit. We're going to learn from some best practices with regards to community engagement as it's been done well here in the Durham community and in North Carolina. And we're going to explore how Duke can become and continue to be, in some instances, a trusted partner in those conversations. So we've got really an exceptional panel, and I wish we had hours and hours to talk with each. So we're going to hear from each of them, and you're going to, I think, have a sense of that if you don't already, to just appreciate what a wealth of experience and expertise we've got here. We've got leaders from local nonprofit organizations that are on the screen right now, including Kendra Johnson, Executive Director of Equality NC. We also have Pilar Roca-Goldberg, President and CEO of El Centro Hispano. We've got Nia Wilson, who's Executive Director of Spirit House. We've got an opportunity to talk with members of the Duke research community. We may hear from Fan Lee a little bit later on. And we've also got leaders who are doing a lot of important community engagement work, who work for the city of Durham. Constance Tansel and Linwood Best. And we're going to hear from about some of their experiences in terms of thinking about neighborhood improvement, neighborhood outreach in ways that I think can directly inform a lot of these conversations we need to have. So we want this to be a conversation. We want to hear from everybody. I have a few questions that if people are okay with that, to kind of start this conversation. For a few minutes, I want to talk directly about ideas related to community engagement. And here we want to have a conversation which we're highlighting successes, but also talking about challenges in some very important ways. And so we'll first hear from some of our nonprofit leaders who are on the screen. And then we're also going to hear about the city government experience. But I want to open the initial part of the discussion here with an example. An example that is very recent in the context of this pandemic, and an example of the work that Spirit House has done directly to attempt to engage with different communities and to put positive messages out there. So I'm going to just share my screen briefly here just to show you an example of a campaign that hopefully you're seeing on the screen now, an example of work from Spirit House, and you'll see that. And there are numerous examples of this from a local campaign effort. I'll show you just a couple here that are really illustrative of the work that that Spirit House has done. And I'm going to invite Nia Wilson onto the screen here to talk about this, to talk about the experience of developing that effort, but also her thoughts on community engagement sort of in general. And so Nia, thank you for joining us here this morning. I want to turn over the stage here to you to talk just a little bit about your thoughts on community engagement and what we might learn from the experience of Spirit House thus far.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be able to be here this morning. Spirit House is a cultural arts and organizing organization. And so we use media, we use art, we use culture to be able to amplify the needs and the visions and the voices of Black people in Durham and actually across the South. So, these past few months there's been sort of a double hit in our community, both with Corona and COVID and the numbers that have been produced about the risks to our community, and also with the exposure, the increased exposure to violence in our communities by police officers. And so both of those things over the past few months have been very impactful in our community. And it both emotionally, mentally, spiritually, that has sent us into a state of grief as a community. And sometimes it's unrecognizable by folks that, people understand that grief looks different in different ways. You may not understand it as grief, but we've been dealing with a lot of grief, a lot of sadness, a lot of anger. And so we try to use our media platforms, our social justice platforms, to get folks to connect to what you're dealing with, what we're dealing with, and sort of being able to find ways to move through what some of us understand, that are happening in our bodies, the increased cortisol, the increased tension and all of the feelings that we have. And so we had two campaigns that we were moving over the last several months. One was Black People Breathe. And as you saw in one of the pictures, it says on the count of 3, breathe with me. And it literally is just encouraging people to take deep breaths so that we can reduce our level of stress and anxiety, to acknowledge what the grief and the fear and the anger that folks are feeling, and also to talk about the fact that we have the ability in our own bodies to just calm ourselves down, to be able to face the things that we're facing. And so we were sharing those different photos of children, of adults, there's lots of them on our Instagram page, for just encouraging people to take a moment and take a deep breath. We also have on our YouTube page a couple of meditation videos that also begin with, on the count of 3, breathe with me. So anyone who has looked at or been to our YouTube page and seen one of the 2 videos up also recognizes that on the count of 3, breathe with me kind of statement. Then we also, in our trying to figure out how to have us talk through what Corona how it has impacted us, we also sort of took a stab at this who's essential piece, because, historically, we have not been seen as essential to the very fiber of this country, except for our labor. And so, and now we have been essential, even folks who work, low wage jobs have become essential to the comfort of folks who have more wealth. And so we wanted to, again, address this "you are essential" piece by saying that we're all essential. We always are all essential, even if it's just to our families, to the people who love us. We need to be able to understand that we are all essential and that it is important for us to see ourselves and to see our families as essential. And so we started a series. We partnered with Ngozi Design, which is a design collective of folks who they had a store downtown for a while, who specialize in African-centered clothing and other products. And so they were making face masks for the community. And so we partnered with Ngozi, and we have, I think, distributed, I think probably over about 500 masks that have like an African pattern to them. There's also inserts in the little package of the masks that are encouraging quotes from folks in the African-American community. And so we partnered with Ngozi. We also partnered with La Samilia, who also is an organization that's been doing food distribution. And we gave masks to them, as well as some herbs, some healing herbs and things that we also partnered with another herbalist, a Latina herbalist. And we were able to also provide sort of tinctures, wellness type tinctures for folks to be able to take during this time. But the goal was always to have people understand how essential we all are to each other, and that it's important for us to put ourselves first. And so while we're having all this conversation about protecting other folks and making sure we're not transmitting diseases and corona, it's important for us to understand that we have to raise that message about how essential we are, how important we are, how valuable we are, and therefore how important it is for us to take care of each other. And so again, you know, as I said, there's several photos in this series that are on our Instagram page, on our Twitter page, on our Facebook page for folks to look at.
Thank you. There's so much in that comment, not the least of which, though, is just this really important reminder of the fact that everybody as individuals have dynamic lives, and that, you know, things are different in 2020 than they were 2018 in some ways. You know, we often think about community engagement as though we're somehow reaching a static community, and this idea that we've also got to pay attention to the history that many people are going through, we're all going through right now, is really important to our conversation. So I want to shift here and ask a similar question to Pilar, to talk about the experiences of El Centro Español in the last few months, but then also thinking beyond that on this theme of community engagement. What does it really mean? And we heard some great examples of that from Nia just a moment ago, but if you could add to that, Pilar, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for having me today. Yes, this, I think with this pandemic, we were able really to do what we say you should do, to engage the community, is to listen to the needs to the community and act to really support the community. And that's our mission, yes, at El Centro. So when the pandemic started, we started listening from people about they needed food, mainly because they were getting laid off of work, the places were closing, so they needed food. We always, our approach for that, we don't have a food bank, but always we collaborate with other stakeholders. So we always refer people to the different services. The issue at that point when we got together with people who were having food to distribute is that they weren't able to get to the Latinx community. So when we look at the other side of the thing, we were hearing from the community members, they got food, and some food they didn't know how to prepare because it's not part of their culture. So what we did is we started calling for people to donate food, and we started distributing food. So we got together with our management team and said, okay, what do we need to do? This is the need of the community. So we restructured our organization in a way to go virtual for services, to open more phone lines for people to call us so we can direct the calls to the homes of our staff members so they can respond to the community, open more lines for the social media. Our community lately has been more active in Facebook and Messenger, and it's a way they are communicating with us. So we put in place somebody to be there all day responding to these needs to the community. And then the other thing we were looking at was the communication about the COVID, yes? What is happening, what is it, how do you need to take care of yourself? And all the information was in English. So we weren't finding information in Spanish, or there was some information, but it wasn't culturally appropriate for our community to understand what was happening and what to do. And also how to access to some of the services, because we know there are gaps, big, huge gaps in and disparities for our community that existed before COVID and were highlighted with COVID. Yes, like access to healthcare, economic development, paying for sick leave. So we developed communications campaign. We got together with Spanish media outlets and we developed a communications campaign together, putting out messages that the community could understand and everybody could share with everybody. So then we again finished restructuring our organization, and almost all the staff went to help people over the phone with different needs they had, distributing food, open up emergency fund to help people to buy food. So what we did is people applied for it and we bought the food in Latinx supermarkets so people could get the food they usually eat, and also to help with rental and utilities assistance. And at the same time, taking advantage of this point and to going to what Nia was saying is that, that we were in the front line and now we were seeing, unfortunately, a lot of the cases were in the Latinx community, yes, disproportionately affected. So in the state, we got almost to 40%, and we are 9% of the population in the state. And in Durham, it was a week we were 80%, almost 80% of the cases, when we are 14% of the population. And that has, a lot of things are the need, but then we were somehow, not in a good way, in the statistics, and everybody was trying to get to the community and how we can help the community. So taking advantage of this situation to continue advocating for the community and advocating again to tell people, highlighting that these disparities existed before, this is not new for us, now are highlighted. What are we going to do not only to help the community right now, but also when we go back to normality, that we don't know what that means yet, but we don't want to go back to where we were previous COVID. We want to go back to something better, yes, to something that really takes care of the community in general. And I think this also helps thinking about how we can help to talk about community and stop dividing the community so we can really engage the community. And also how minorities, we need to continue getting together to share the resources that are out there, because the pie is not getting bigger. Yes, it's the same pie, but how we can stop fighting with each other, but take advantage of what is going on. The other thing we did, also to Nia's point, was we were seeing people with, again, no jobs, getting problems with paying rent and utilities, and we went out to the community saying, and people needed masks, yes, so we went back to the community saying, who is making masks? And we started buying masks from community members that were making these masks, so we can support them and also support the community using masks and distributing masks. And we continue doing that and working with more community health workers. That was the other good advantage we could take care of, is because they needed to get to more community members, they were able to put out their money for minorities to hire community health workers to get to the community. And what a best way to bring our own community members as community health workers so they can really work with their own community to support their needs. So right now we are working on that and looking again on how we can leverage from this to continue when the pandemic is over.
Yeah. So Pilar, something that's just quite humbling, even just to realize, you had a few minutes to talk about this, and the number of times that you emphasize need and identifying and recognizing needs and starting there. It's just really important, I think, for our conversation, and something that we easily overlook. That maybe that one of the most important things we can do is just have a better sense of what our community's needs are, and then think about how to address those, and then a lot falls into place after that. So I appreciate that that comment and so much of it. I also want to bring Kendra Johnson into the conversation here to talk about the experience of Equality NC amidst both the pandemic and more broadly, with ideas that might inform our conversation. So Kendra, what ideas do you have on that?
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what Nia and Pilar said, that I think the starting point for us dealing with this new scenario of misinformation coming from, frankly, public health officials and from the highest office of this country, we wanted to ensure that we had a good sense of what our community needed. So one of the first things that we did was actually to do a caller program and call through our entire list of membership to check in and do a survey to understand what people understood about COVID, what were their basic needs, what were their greatest fears. And based on that survey, we were able to shift some of our programming as we were shifting to digital. One of the biggest issues for folks, besides food insecurity and transportation, was just a feeling of isolation. And so we were able to create particularly a program for our elders who many times, because they are LGBTQ+, do not have good familial connections because of rejection and stigma, and pair them with youth who are LGBTQ+, who might have been going through the same things at home with their families, to have a friendly caller program to check in on our elders, to make sure that their needs were being met. And also create forums where we were intentional about ensuring that folks knew how to dial in or were guided through new technology in order to have a point of connection regularly with other elders where they could voice their concerns and we could ensure that their needs were being met. Externally, we looked at how we could translate the information that was coming from news and media and to laser target that to the LGBTQ community, i.e., many people in the beginning, there was a lot of misperception that Black folks were immune or that these different groups would not be impacted. And we were able to pull together with some national partners information on the disproportionate impact that it was having on Black and Brown and LGBTQ+ people, particularly the trans and gender non-conforming community, and get that information out to also talk about the impact of loss of employment, which was also disproportionately impacting Black and Brown LGBTQ+ folks. And to also be a hub we don't do mutual aid, but we use our platform to elevate the mutual aid resources that were available, including when there was a call for people who were not resource poor to donate part of their stimulus check to the communities that did not receive stimulus checks. So for the folks who were not in need to share their resources, we elevated that. And then from an advocacy standpoint, we joined forces with a group of 200+ organizations that were really elevating the needs of the folks who are always forgotten, because as Nia and Pilar said, we're always essential. We are always in the low wage earning jobs, and we are left behind when there's a hurricane, we're left behind when there's an economic crisis. And so we joined force with the folks who were in the Fight for 15, folks who were fighting for climate justice, people who were fighting for Medicaid expansion, to really pull together and articulate a list of 10 needs to ask that these communities receive resources from our NCGA, and that these be targeted to combat hunger, folks who are undocumented, low-wage earners, et cetera, to create a baseline of support. And we were able to share resources, information, and mobilize together to articulate the needs of the community that's also always left behind. So I think our role is really sharing information, addressing the needs of folks who are left behind, and trying to underpin the organizations that are providing the direct service. So our folks get the assistance that they need, and they continue to have a sense of community in a time where we're all facing some level of isolation. That's been the approach that we've taken.
Great, thank you, Kendra. That really helps to further emphasize just the importance of relationships, here, and as you think about, helping people overcome misperceptions, but also just again reaching and meeting needs as the first priority. So we've had a number of instances about the experience this year amidst the pandemic. I want to turn our attention now to a story that's a couple years old. To a story that Constance and Linwood will tell about the city of Durham around the turning point of 2018, and some of the instances in which they were able to read and learn from some of the experiences they've had in trying to provide neighborhood improvement. So I want to turn to Constance, and then maybe we can turn to Linwood, and the two of you could talk a little bit about the experiences that you've had in trying to provide neighborhood improvement services to the city of Durham, and how that actually fits into our conversation extremely well. Constance?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to see Nia and Kendra and Pilar. These are people that you see in the community that are really, they have really challenged us to change how we do our work in the city of Durham. And I was just gonna tell you a story about in 2018, the city was getting ready to develop the Durham Beltline, and a group of residents came down to city council and said, hey, wait, stop. You haven't engaged us. No one has talked to us about this project. We don't know what's going on here. So city council stopped the project, and they charged the city administration, which charged neighborhood improvement services, with the task to come up with a engagement plan around the Beltline. That is the downtown Beltline. And we had 90 days to do it. We thought, since we were community engagement for the city of Durham, we thought we knew how to do community engagement until we spent almost 90 days working in the community, actually asking the community what it meant to engage them and how they would like to be engaged. And out of that process, what we developed was a blueprint, and blueprint to engage residents in the city of Durham. And based on that blueprint, we were able to then develop an engagement plan for the Beltline Trail. I can tell you that I said to the city manager, he said, Constance, you've been telling me for 8 years that you knew how to do engagement. I said, well, I thought I did until I really asked the community about how they would want to be engaged. And they really taught us a lot. I tell you, the expertise around engagement is actually in the community. Building relationships, building trust relationships is the foundation to engage in the community. We found that out in our 90-day discussion with the community, and that allowed us to build the blueprint. And I think Linwood has put the blueprint in the chat, so if anyone would like to pull that down. And that's a draft document that we continue to work on with the community and city staff. The other thing that has happened since then, since we had this major paradigm shift, our staff started to look at who we actually are as the engagement staff for the city of Durham. And so there's this quote that we picked up, that I picked up, and we have adopted in our department. And it goes like this: if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. And that's by Leah Watson, an Aboriginal educator and activist. And so we started to see people differently in the community. We actually said, okay, our humanity, we believe our humanity is tied and linked directly to the people we are serving in the community. So now we stop and we see people, we acknowledge them, we understand their pain, their concerns, and we respect their involvement in what we do in the community. So over this last, since March, we looked at how we engage the community differently. Normally we would have brought them something. This time we asked them what their needs were, you know, and they told us in no uncertain terms. And over this last, I guess, 7 to 8 months, we've done a lot of things with the community where we've co-led and we've co-created and we've co-designed. And one of the things that we've done during COVID, we have responded to needs in real time. A lot of people did a lot of virtual things, but working with Spirit House and other community partners, we have served the residents' needs in real time. And then it's going to tell you about some of those things that we've done.
Great. And Constance, just a note here that for folks that are interested, even just a quick Google search for the community, for the blueprint, the community engagement blueprint, City of Durham, will raise that as well. And then we can also try to get that, that link out to Linwood. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Our tagline for since COVID-19 started is, yes, we're open for business. And that's what we were. We were open for business because we know the need was out there. The need was out there before COVID came. After COVID hit, it was just like, we really need to be there. As Constance stated, we actually went out into the community and say, what can we do? How can we help? What are your needs? And we were very fortunate that we had other partners that were out there as well. Summit churches and Nehemiah Church and other churches called us and said, how can we help you help our community? And they actually partnered with us to help us do food drive, get food out there, because people say, we don't have enough access to food. We need food. We don't have access to cleaning supplies. We don't have access to masks and things of that nature. So we really were out there at bus stops and places that people said they needed those things. And we actually had a lot of distribution for us, face covering and masks, and a lot of information about COVID-19. People didn't understand what it was, how would it affect them, how would it affect their family, how does it travel, all the health information we can have, we had it out there in the community. And they also said they needed different programs and different things. So we worked with them to do different programs like the Morning Glory. We had a matching grant program prior to the COVID-19. We actually rearranged it so that it would be something that we can work immediately. People in Morning Glory said that their health worker couldn't come in their community center anymore to help them measure their blood pressure. We actually went out using that grant, went out and purchased blood pressure equipment, so they were able to do those type of things without someone being exposed to the corona possibly in that building. And so it was programs like that. We did Family Island. People said they were stressed, they were tired of being at home. We worked with the bike co-op to create a bike family island where you actually went out to Walk Quarry Park, which is a couple of miles away from some of these people, some of the residents that were asking for this escape. It was a couple miles away. They weren't aware of it. Just getting them exposed to it, getting somebody that does like helmets, bikes, to go out there in the community just to take a bike ride with your family, get to know your family, get some of that stress off of you, get a chance to shake some of this, all this that's on you dealing with the COVID-19 and actually enjoy family life. We actually work with the stimulus checks where we're able to help families get over $81,000 back into the community that they weren't aware, didn't know the processes. We took our City Hall on the Go vehicle out there, which is a mobile unit that we use to take into the community. And our tagline for that is, we see City Hall on the Go coming, help is on the way. So we really try to be out there in the community to help them. Some people said that they wanted something for their children. So some community actually did a virtual art class. She purchased the supplies, put them on people's front doors, gave the children an opportunity to create these paintings and these artworks and these things. And then she actually collected them all, put them in her backyard and create like a backyard museum. Allowed them time where they can actually bring their families and show them their artwork. And this whole community had an art show. And it was very exciting. And we had a virtual cooking class where the food was purchased, put on people's front doors. They'll actually get on the computer, actually learn how to cook healthy foods, know how to season them properly and correctly and exciting and health-wise. So it was really enjoyable. Daughters say, hey, Mom, let's do this together. And it creates a family bonding. We also create some Find My Yoga programs where we actually had yogas outside and 6 feet apart. Everything was social distancing. And But also, as we went along with the process, we did back to school drive as well in the community. And these are community events that we help partner with in the community to do. But we realized too that as COVID was moving along and school was opening up, that there was some digital divide there. People were having these computers in their homes and not knowing how to operate them. So we actually brought in some computer people to help families that had problems with Wi-Fi, connectivities, and we actually had a workshop that allowed the families to talk to the Board of Education about their concerns about this great divide. And I don't know how to work this computer. This is more advanced than I know. Please help me get somebody in here to help me do these things. Because we found one student sitting there 6 days, not knowing how to connect to Wi-Fi and missing classes. So we were able to do those things, which were very exciting things to do. We also had conversations, community conversations, where we actually had 2 of them that was in Spanish. And we reached over 2,000 people in each one of those conversations. And the conversations were dealing with COVID-19. What was the cause? The same things, the cause, the effect. What can I do? It was great. And we also participated in a virtual town hall conversation about COVID and beyond. So we've been really, really excited about the things that we're doing in the community about COVID and trying to help community. But all of this has been done because the community said, this is what we need, this is what we want. It was actually going out into the community, having a conversation with the people in the community to find out what they wanted, what they needed, and how we could help. I was told when I first got into community engagement that we, as the community, said, we know what we want, we just need your help in getting it. And we know what we need, we just need your help in getting it. So that's what we're trying to do. Help those community people doing these programs that we think will help benefit them, help them through this pandemic. They needed help prior to the pandemic, but this is also to help them to get through this pandemic as best as we possibly can.
Great.
Brian, can I say that Nia and Pilar and Kendra, people like those are the community partners that helped us do this work. We were not the main ones to do it. Spirit House was one of our community partners who directly worked with us to do so many things. We had a Juneteenth parade, and that was about getting information out about the census, about COVID. They've done so many creative things, and we are truly partners with them, and they are the ones who are driving this. And I want to say thank you to the 3 of them and all of the other community partners that we have in the city of Durham.
Thank you to all of you. There's so much, just on a deeply personal level, honestly, to have an opportunity this morning to be so inspired and to celebrate some things amidst everything else. It's wonderful to be able to have that conversation. Something that we can challenge everybody that's on the line right now. It goes to Linwood's point. Here we're having a conversation this morning with a few hundred people. How do we ensure that we have further conversations with thousands? How do we ensure that we are able to bring more people into conversations like this? We're in a situation being able to take advantage of some technology. What else could we do to broaden that conversation so we're hearing more voices going forward? So just some food for thought, even as we have this conversation right here. So I want to bring Fan Lee into the conversation because this panel, this discussion, we wanted to talk about how through building trust, we might actually help people avoid challenges of misperceptions. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those misperceptions about science and those misperceptions that have been circulating. And I'm seeing here, and I might have some internet instability, so I apologize if I'm a little bit glitching here. But Fan, could you talk to us a bit about some of the misperceptions that you've heard and things that we might want to be thinking about in terms of helping our neighbors through this situation?
Thanks. Thanks first to Brian and Don for organizing this wonderful and very timely event. And also second, really thank to my co-panelists. I feel that it's really humbling to hear this morning that what you have done in this very difficult situation to help the community to go through this horrific pandemic. So I come from, I'm a professor at Duke. So and also I'm Asian American, so I offer a little bit different kind of perspective, my unique perspective, my personal perspective to this. So this is this pandemic really affect different people of different community or different group differently. It's particularly disproportionately affect the already disadvantaged group, right? So we all know that. And as Asian Americans, so we, one thing is interesting is I'm a Chinese American, and then when I go to the street, everyone will see me as Asian American. Nobody will see that whether I'm Chinese or Korean or Japanese, right? So we're all lumped into this Asian American perspective. And of course, the pandemic really started from China. And so in the early days, actually 2 months before all of this, the pandemic come to US, the Chinese community already very aware of, well, this terrible disease. But nobody at that time saw that this will actually circulate to US and then actually become a world problem. And some background before that was, the US and Chinese relationship, of course, wasn't that good. So then this is kind of a double hit. Once it's come, so these things, it's already not good. And again, this is not, so there's already like the anti-China or anti-Asian sentiment already was high. And then the COVID pandemic doesn't help. So actually there's a statistic showing that the anti-Asian crime or incident has increased dramatically after March. And so again, that is kind of expected, but that's sad because when we're talking about locally in Durham, we don't have a very large Asian community, but actually the Asian community is pretty focused, concentrated in the universities. There's a lot of foreign students, a lot of Asian students. And for those students, it's really, again, the hit is really a triple hit because first of all, they are separate from because the isolation, right? And the isolation as everyone. So, and also they're being accused of, well, not accused, but they are, the anti-China, anti-Asian sentiment really affect them more. And also because they're isolated, it's much more difficult for them to get the necessary support, mental support. And also, the misinformation also goes both ways. And now you go back to, if you read the media in China, then there's also like all the students, all this Asian Americans or Chinese American living in US, they cannot, if they want to go back to China, visit their family, there's no way, they're not allowed to even get into the country. And then they are subject to very severe monitoring and things. So, and I feel a lot of the students, especially the student first, this might be the first year or second year they come to US, and they got hit hard really by this. And I think Duke is doing a great job trying to help to provide the mental support, the emotional support for those students, but still it is a long way to go. And as faculty, we usually try our best to, we talk to our advisee and periodically make sure that they are okay. But that's, I always feel that we probably can do more. But again, all of this, all the isolation make life difficult for everyone. But again, I think I have to say, comparing to a lot of the economically disadvantaged group or the minority group or LGBT group. So maybe what I just said, the Asian Americans or the Asian students is just a very small portion, and comparing to others, it's not as severe. But I still want to point it out, like this pandemic really affect many different groups pretty hard. And so I really appreciate all my co-panelists, what you have done. I think this is wonderful. I just hope more people can do this, and also I hope that people can be united. And people really, unity is important in this horrific times. And let's hope that we all get together and address this issue.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Fan. So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to open the floor here. Given the audience that we have, if there are thoughts and comments and takeaway messages that people want to express, I'll just offer just a brief one that kind of connects the dots here, and a really important theme. I think back on the experience in Philadelphia a few decades ago when they were evaluating a vaccination effort. They spent a lot of money on a very well-crafted communication campaign ultimately didn't work. The question was raised, why? And we spent on persuasive messaging. And something they had overlooked, and something that they heard loud and clear, was that they had opened the clinic at sort of odd hours, that people didn't know when they could get there. There was a lot of concern just about the logistics. Most important piece of information was, how am I going to actually get there, because I'm working at this hour, working at that hour. A really important oversight. And I think we're hearing that again here. We have to start from need and start to understand what it is that people need in their lives, and how can we do a better job of listening to that. So I want to open the floor here. If anybody's so moved, some last thoughts that you'd like. Maybe come back around to maybe Nia and Pilar. We sort of started our conversation, but anything that you'd like to just quickly note here for this audience, and then hopefully we're having additional conversations after this. But yeah, maybe Nia.
Yeah, sure. I really, really appreciate this panel and everything that I've heard. It helps me to understand just how important it is for us to collaborate and work together, to not be siloed off. Although we all work in different demographics, each of our demographics is important. And the needs are different for each of our demographics, but there is not one that is less than the other. And so it is really, really important for us to find a way to work together to be able to grow what we're doing so that all of our communities' needs are met. I think in speaking about misinformation and mistrust, a thing for the institution to think about is the history of the institution's impact in the community, and that the way to shift that and to build trust is to work directly with the community organizations that are doing the work. And so, when I first started working in Spirit House, and we used to get lots of requests from Duke, from students or from different people who are doing different projects, and they would send us the project and say, can we get your help putting this out into the community? And we would say, absolutely not, because you didn't come to us or come to the community as you were developing the project. You developed the project on campus and then expected us to help you facilitate it happening. And that's not how we work. And it was years and years and years and years and years and years before that shifted for us. Because we began having relationships with people at the university, as opposed to relationships with the university. We began having relationships with people who were there, and then we built trust and were able to work with each other, so that we weren't necessarily thinking about this entity, but we were thinking about the individuals and what they were trying to do at that level. Again, we are not academics. And so, and there is a need for academia in this society. And so then how do we develop relationships in all of these different places so that we can work together and accomplish that? I really love what I've heard. I would love to find ways for us to continue to work together so that we can get the resources that we need for all of our communities.
Yeah, and you're phrasing there just a little bit, but you left us with plenty of food for thought.
The last thing I want to say.
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Nia. I'm sorry, you're back. Yeah.
Oops. Well, I want to say something before I hop on. And maybe
Yes, please.
So I just want to echo what Nia was saying, which I think is important, is that in order to build trust with the community inside of academic institutions and medical institutions, the approach cannot be theoretical. The approach cannot be academic. You have to have directly impacted people who understand their own lived reality at the table, conducting the work. I think all of us have said that to a certain extent. I think Constance said that you thought you knew community outreach until the community told you how they wanted you to be engaged. I think that goes forward, where I think the community of LGBTQ folks, Black and Brown folks, folks who are disabled are tired of people approaching us with theories about our lives that do not directly engage us in conducting how we address the problems that we live every day. So that's for hospitals, it's a consumer advisory boards.
For academia, it is looking around the table and seeing who's not there and making sure that they have a meaningful role, not just for consultation, but in shifting and shaping the work that you propose to do. That's the first big step towards building trust.
Such an important point. Nia, if you're back, I just want to give you an opportunity. You broke up there a little bit at the end.
Oh, I'm good. I was making a joke.
Well, I'd like to hear it actually. Can you, yeah.
I was just saying I'm going to steal the idea of the cooking classes from the city, because I think that
we'll work with you, Nia.
That's the most,
we'll do it
maybe
with
the
you.
most important thing.
I would love to do that. I think it's an amazing idea. And the thing I do want to add about that is that the way that again, being able to connect with the people who are already doing the work is important. So connecting, for instance, with restaurants who are also impacted by COVID to teach a cooking class and provide the food is one of the things that we've been trying to figure out how to do. And that way it brings resources to the people who also need the resources.
Yes.
Great.
Want to, if I
Go ahead, Pilar. Yes, go ahead. Yep.
One thing, I've been in the both sides. As I started working actually at Duke in research when I came from Colombia 16 years ago. And then I became the CEO of El Centro after I learned about the community and I wanted to do something different. So I think it is important to understand the roles of each other, the institutions, the research, but also the stakeholders and the nonprofits. And also that I think Duke is changing, but I think needs to do more about it is, as the point of Kendra was saying, when come to work with us and to get to the community, I understand the mean is a good meaning, but also understand that our time is valuable. And as nonprofits, we are always looking for how to maintain our organizations, how to fund our organization, have the staff to serve the community. So have that in mind, not only coming, help us doing this. It's only putting this flyer out. It's only filling out this survey. It's really time and the expertise. And not only from the nonprofits, but from community members, bringing their insights and their expertise.
Great.
And from the city's perspective, we have to be humble, and we have to continue to listen to the community. And even when they are having a tough conversation with us, we have to be open to hear what they have to say, because that's where the learning and growing takes place. And Linwood and I view ourselves now as change agents for within the system, and for advocates for the community to push for systemic change in the organization where we work. There's a lot of good stuff going on in the city, but we are one of those groups that are just pushing for more and more change, probably more quickly than some may want, but that's our mission, is to first listen to the community, work very closely with the community, work with the community, being co-led and creating things together. And one of the statements that we have in one of our documents says that relationships and the resulting trust between individuals and groups and the city government is both the root and the sum of all engagement activities. And we actually believe that. So that's who we are about right now, is just pushing the boundaries within the city system.
Great. Fan or Linwood, any last words there, quick? No.
Okay.
Linwood. Oh, you're muted, Linwood.
I just want to make sure that when we have these meetings and we have these programs, that we do bring community into this. They have a say and they should be involved. We shouldn't be talking about them. They should be in here talking with us and working with us to get through these problems and these issues and their concerns. So let's open the doors a little wider and let people in.
So I want to invite everybody to be thinking about how we can do that, challenge us to do that, and let's see what we can do to follow up further. We've had a couple of great comments come in. Already requests to share this recording with other members of the Duke community and the wider community as well. So I'm going to note that for the organizers, and also request directly both praise and thanks for all the work that our panelists are doing, but also I'm going to ask for links and information. I'm going to direct people to the list there that we've got in terms of advertising this event, but also the organizers might think about putting that out in the chat as well for this particular panel. And hopefully this is the beginning of additional conversations. Thank you. We've got to get off the stage now for the next event, but sincerely, thank you. And let's see what we can do to push each other and connect further on this. We'll get through it together. All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. I think we're waiting on just one more of our attendees to join us, be reassigned, and I'm seeing our faces here.
Hello, Dane. Can you hear me? It's Holly
Yes.
Lewis. Okay, great.
Holly.
How are you? And can you see my video as well?
I can't see your video.
Is that a yes? I'm sorry. Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm in a dimly lit room at the VA hospital.
Holly's taking a break from her surgical schedule to join us today.
Dane, did you see Vanity's message about her camera?
Yes. Well, let's see if we can get that
I'm
turned
here now.
on.
I'm here now.
Oh, good. Oh, good. All right. And then Roxana, are you able to be?
I'm having issues plugging in my camera. It says it's inability by the amphitryon. Okay, there
There
you go.
you are.
Here.
All
How
right.
are you, everybody?
Doing well. How about you? So I think that last person we are waiting on, and then we'll get started, is Candace Cox. And I see, and I want to make sure there we go. All right. It looks like we're getting her video on now.
Yay, there we are.
Yay, okay. We are all here. Thank you for your patience. So I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone for being here and being part of this conversation. I am so excited and honored to be helping with moderating this panel with Dr. Holly Lewis. And I've got some special permission to get out of the OR, so thank you, surgery, for that. I wanted to start off by providing a little bit of framework before we get into this conversation. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the term of intersectionality. And I think that, you know, we've probably been hearing this word more and more, but I wanted to give a little history. So it was, for those of you that don't know, it was coined in the 1980s by Kimberly Crenshaw. Black law professor at both UCLA and Columbia Law Schools. And it was in order to help describe the unique experience of being a Black woman. And the need for this term stemmed from a court case. And Crenshaw will often talk about this DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. And so Emma DeGraff and Reed and 4 other African-American women argued that they were receiving compound discrimination because of their race and gender, which is what excluded them from their employment opportunities. The courts weighed their allegations of discrimination based on race and gender separately. And they found that since General Motors employed Black male factory workers, allegations of racial discrimination could not be proved. Likewise, General Motors' employment of white female office workers also disproved gender discrimination. And then the court declined to consider the concept of compound discrimination and dismiss the case. And so I think that today intersectionality is becoming more and more important as we recognize within ourselves, within others, within the people that we live and work with and spend our time with, that there are an increasing number of layers of identities. And some of these identities may bring privilege, protection, and some prejudice or harm. And so it's really important for us to consider those layers and how they may affect each of us individually in our everyday lives. So staying with the intersection term, we can see that gender identity and being a person of color are 2 different streets. However, those streets intersect. They may intersect even again as one's gender identity is a man, woman, or someone who has a different gender identity entirely. And so we have found that there are significant health disparities among LGBTQ people of color and LGBTQ people who are white and the general population. And this is related to both COVID-19, loss of jobs during COVID-19, transgender people of color are more likely to have taken an unpaid leave or a pay cut during this time, more likely to have been switched to house or to part-time work, or have had changes to their budget, as well as being more biologically vulnerable. And so that's why I think it's so important for us to really recognize this very special intersectionality. And so on this panel, we have chosen to elevate these strong voices in the community who carry with them both racial and or ethnic identities, as well as gender identities that do not reflect the sex that they were assigned at birth. So the experiences of these individuals are unique relative to those who live on only 1 or 2 streets. We have multiple streets that people are living on. We're thinking about intersectionality. And so now I would like to introduce, and I feel like I'm wondering if Holly, if we want to quickly say who we are and then bring it to our panelists who are really the stars of the show here.
Yes, let's begin. Would you like to go first?
Sure. So Holly Christopher Lewis is a PGY2 in the Duke General Surgery residency. Her clinical and research interests include tissue engineering and reconstructive surgery. She earned her MD and PhD at Emory University with a focus on immunology and chemical biology. She is developing hydrogel models of wound healing and cell therapy within Duke's School of Engineering and passionate about addressing disparities in medicine. And the use of bioinformatics to better understand social determinants of health. She's active in outcomes research, publishing on medical racism and sickle cell disease, clinical determinants of poor overall survival after breast cancer, and wound infections. You're gonna have to tell me this word.
Dehiscences.
Thank you, and plastic surgery. With faculty for plastic surgery, she's leading the Duke study on gender health and wellness during COVID-19, with an initiative to understand how the pandemic has impacted transgender and non-binary patients nationwide.
Thank you so much, Dane. I'm really excited to be here. I've worked with Dane at Duke for some of the initiatives that he is a part of with the Sexual and Gender Diversity Advisory Council at Duke. And he and I are both really excited about the folks we have invited today to share their perspectives. And I'm really looking forward to kind of elevating their voices and hearing from these different community elements around the Carolinas to kind of talk more about the role of misinformation, bias, and these structural elements in our society that are really impacting different groups disproportionately. I will introduce Dane. Dane is trained as a clinical psychologist, and he is a medical instructor at Duke in the Department of Psychiatry, Behavioral Sciences. He works as a therapist and performs behavioral health assessments for individuals who are identified as transgender and may be interested in exploring their options for gender affirming medications or therapies. Dane also is the director of LGBTQ+ initiatives at the Duke Office of Diversity and Inclusion, which is a part of the School of Medicine. And he is the faculty advisor for Duke Med Pride. Dane really enjoys teaching medical learners, physician assistant students, physical therapy students about the importance of cultural disparities, cultural determinants of health disparity outcomes. Since coming to Duke, Dane has conducted over 70 different trainings and workshops focusing on best practices for working with LGBTQ patients, clinical learners as well, inside and outside of the Duke environment. He is a co-director for equity in research at the Clinical and Translational Science, the Duke CTSI Institute, where he plays a role in curriculum development and also is a consultant focusing on promoting diversity, equity, and anti-racism in Duke's research environments. Dane and I are both very excited to be here. Thank you.
And so now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and we have a fantastic lineup of people. I was so excited and honored when everyone said yes. This is like the dream team, and so I'm wondering if, this is something that I can either introduce you, or if you would like, you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what each of you would like to highlight. Sam, you're kind of next on my screen. Would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to say something about yourself?
I don't mind introducing myself. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, so my name is Sam Aldave, and my pronouns are he, him, and they, them. I am a third-year graduate student at Duke. I am in the divinity school. Currently, right now, spending a lot of time working on my thesis, which is around the intersection of Blackness, transness, and being a person of faith.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course.
And then, thank you. Vanity, you're next on my screen. Would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Dane. Good morning. It's still morning. Good morning to everyone who's here in attendance and in viewership. My name is Vanity Reed Dieterville. I respond to she and her pronouns. I am a recent graduate of the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, with a degree in political science concentrating in public policy, hailing now as the new Gender Resources Advocacy Support Program, also known as GRASP, Program Director at the LGBTQ Center of Durham. And I am very excited to share my thoughts with you all today on mistrust and misinformation.
Thank you so much, Vanity. We're so happy you're here. Roxana, you are next on my screen.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm so glad being here with everybody here this morning. So my name is Roxana Picasso, and I've been working for El Centro Hispano for these last 2.5 years, working as a coordinator support transgender women around the Triangle area. So I'm very glad to share any thoughts or any help I can provide to the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. And Candace, would you like me to introduce you?
Sure.
Let's change it up a little, okay. So we have Candace Cox, who I have had the privilege of hearing speak many times. And she is part of Equality and CC4 board since 2016, and she serves as the secretary as well as sitting on the executive committee. Candace also sits on the board of the LGBT Democrats of Wake County and previously on the board of the Crepe Myrtle Festival. Candace holds a BA in sociology from NC State and has worked with helping to develop our inclusion policies for numerous triangle and national organizations, including the Human Rights Campaign. And so she's also the sole transgender person to have met with Governor Pat McCrory regarding HB2 as this bill was being passed. She's been featured on CNN and MSNBC and lending a transgender voice and perspective to issues that come up. And she is a passionate educator to others about the need for inclusion, improving the lives of transgender individuals. Her personal time is spent enjoying the two things she loves, her family and travel. And so we're so glad to have you here, Candace. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And shopping.
And well, of course, shopping, yes. And Revi, last but not least, would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to introduce yourself?
Awesome. I can take it from here. Hey, everybody. Good morning. My name is Revi Kern. I use the pronouns they, them, and theirs, and I'm the Director of Education Policy at Equality North Carolina. It's really great to be here with all of you. I've been working with the organization for just over a year now, continuing on over a decade of experience supporting queer youth within policy, within leadership, in schools across the nation. This is a crucial time, and so it's important to be able to be present on this panel as we navigate some of the weirdest times, the hardest times that we've had. And so any opportunity to help create some education around experience, it's always an honor to be among other BIPOC trans folks. So thank you all for taking your time out, for being here as well.
Thank you all thank you, Rebby, and thank you all for being here. So this panel is going to be a conversation style. And so we have questions that we're going to be asking the panelists and inviting people to answer or add, or if a discussion evolves from this, then we will spend some time doing that. So we'd really like to be organic and kind of hearing about the the perspectives from the panelists. And so I will start by asking the first question. So at Duke, we strive to provide every patient with the best healthcare experience possible. However, we also know that often larger healthcare systems like Duke are especially at risk for creating mistrust through our patient interactions for a variety of reasons. And for example, those could include having inaccurate information in our electronic health records, a higher turnover rates among staff, and the nature of academic medical centers is having rotating trainees, et cetera. Also the hierarchical structure within medicine, I think, is highlighted. So given all of that, in your experiences with healthcare systems, have there been instances that have made you mistrustful of those systems or medical care in general? And I can, I don't know if someone.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I will happily start that off. So I think that's kind of an obvious, like, yes, for me being a person who's brown, because that, I always say, is what walks into the room first before my gender identity, anything. I'm a Black person. And so has there ever been an uncomfortable? And for me, the answer is, has there ever been a comfortable would be the better answer. I'd have a shorter way to respond to that, because I have all of the stigma, on me. Like, I can go somewhere and, it's never, it's the microaggressions. It's never, your insurance card. It is, do you have insurance? And just that little thing right there, like, it's like the assumption is that I might not actually have healthcare coverage, because people who belong to my demographic, we don't. And it's those little things that really stick in you. And then you carry a burden with you when you hear people talking about studying sickle cell, or talking about diabetes and high blood pressure. And I'm aware that Black people disproportionately suffer from all of those things. So I, all of a sudden am this person walking in who's like, oh, my health is in jeopardy. My lifestyle could lead me to being exposed to all kinds of, things. And then as a trans person, I'm like, do I ever feel uncomfortable? Constantly, because I have to explain to you my process, what I've had done, if I've had surgery or any type of physical augmentations to my body. And then for so many trans women, especially trans women of color, was it surgically done? Was it done by Black market? Is it free-base silicone? And then we know that physicians, they're not taught anything about that in medical school or residency. So now I have to educate you, which makes me feel even more like an outsider and like a freak, because I'm having to explain myself to you because it's so foreign. So yeah, I'm like, every encounter with healthcare is uncomfortable when you are, brown. And then when you add in the intersectionality of being trans and a trans woman, like, I love the questionnaire. It's like, when was the date of your last menstrual cycle? I didn't have one. oh, when did you have a hysterectomy? I didn't have one. Like, I know enough about medicine to know that those things aren't even pertinent right now. I just need, you know, a painkiller because I have a toothache, and the dentist isn't open on the weekends, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing all of that to the table. That I think, no, please don't apologize. This is why we are having this conversation. I think we want to understand how mistrust and the things that we do as an institution or even as individual community members or providers really affect who we are. And it, from what you're saying, it sounds like I can't even imagine taking all of those things into account in a place that's supposed to take care of you and really feeling like and really truly having the burden of almost guiding people to take care of yourself.
When you're Black, you become accustomed. You grow up knowing that the system just isn't here for you. I don't view, my parents are physicians, and even I will say, I don't view, you know, doctors and hospitals and everything as being an institution of aid and help, but more of a laboratory, you know?
Yeah.
Like for me as a Black person, I'm like, it's a laboratory. That's all it is.
Sam, it sounded like something there resonated with you.
Yeah, a lot of what Kendra said resonated with me. I just want to affirm all of her statements and that feeling of like your Blackness like preceding you. I feel like I've experienced that to a really great degree. So I live with bipolar disorder, and I live with bipolar type 1, which means that I can have some rather extreme high manic episodes and pretty extreme low depressive episodes. And I was hospitalized one time. I was hospitalized a few times, but this specific time it was involuntary for mania. And I, you know, had been taking my medications, but like, and so I took my medications every day, so I knew which medications I was supposed to take. And then when I got to the hospital, they started trying to give me medications that I had never heard of before. And so I wanted more information about what these medications were that they were having me take, because they weren't on my chart. Like, no doctor that I'd ever seen before had prescribed them to me. And so I wanted to learn more about them. And I was getting, when you're in a manic state, you're already on the edge of agitated, like all the time. And so I was becoming more agitated at the fact that no one would answer my questions. They were just saying, like, just take these pills because you need to take them. And what ultimately ended up happening was they sedated me. They injected me with something that sedated me. And then I woke up and I was handcuffed to the hospital bed. And I was like, what happened? Like, I don't understand. And a Black nurse came in the room and she was like, honey, you know, when you look like us, you can't make them feel threatened, like, in any way. And your questions felt like a threat to too many white people. And like, I wish I could take you out of these handcuffs, but like, you have to be in them for at least like a certain number of hours. And it just was an extremely like dehumanizing experience, on top of just feeling like so disempowering, like just because of the fact that I was Black, like I lost the ability to be an advocate for myself. And that was just very challenging.
And it almost sounds like the nurse who came and talked to you after the sedation kind of wore off was even in a position where she wasn't empowered to help you, but she understood like the experience, or at least to a certain degree, kind of what you had gone through, and that racism was part of it. And yeah, wow.
May I add a small note about that?
Please.
Both Candace and Sam, thank you for sharing and being transparent with us about where we slip into the gaps when it comes to our linkage to healthcare. I won't speak on it too much because I see that I could connect it better with the second question. However, there's a reason for the weakening of the rapport between the medical and the Black community and the medical and the queer communities. The struggle of that relationship is largely historical, and it is also rooted in racist experimentation. And so I'd like to come back to that thought for the second question, so we can kind of understand why there's a historical mistrust that we're speaking about right now.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We'll go to the second. No, because Vanity's got me. I'm like, yes, yes. Thank you for going there. I'm like, oh, did we have to wait for the second question? Because I'm like,
Okay,
oh yeah.
No, let's just go in. Let's just go in.
Know,
I think it's important.
So what you brought, kind of to the forefront, Vanity, is the fact that and also Sam, is that for African Americans especially, but also, anyone who is of brown skin, honestly, health issues is such a stigma. It's something that we don't talk about within ourselves, and our families, and mental health issues. And so what we find is that we disproportionately are going through life misdiagnosed and undiagnosed. If you go to a group home, if you go to a children's hospital for psychiatric help, you will see it is disproportionately represented by Black and brown people. And that does not mean that we suffer from, but that means honestly that we are misdiagnosed, or we just go, by the wayside. And for me, the problem that we're finding is that, we see people going into the ED, and the physicians are missing the opportunity to say, perhaps this person has FASD. And instead, we just assume that this person's just, that's how they are, and we know that is the truth. And the healthcare system really needs to recognize that, we aren't white America. We don't grow up talking about stuff. We don't grow, we don't, in our community, we don't have words where we, bipolar. I mean, I can tell you in my own personal experience that word is something that is a rarity within the African American community. Like we don't really talk that much about that. And a lot of that stems from that experimentation. We want to distance ourselves from disease. My grandmother is still alive. She was born in Alabama. She knew people who were affected by all of that awful, experimentation. And that makes her see a white coat as something that's going to harm her. And so she distanced herself from, yeah. Ooh, I'm sorry, Vanity. I'm gonna shut up.
No,
Speak,
no.
Vanity.
It's
because everything you were saying, Vanity, I was just like, yes.
So since we're going to open the can of worms, Dane, if I may, I guess I'll go ahead and hop into my answer. I read a book about America's legacy of enduring injury and healing by a Black female scholar, Dr. Joy DeGruy, called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And within this book, she talks about the history and the inception of modern medicine as we know it. She speaks about gynecology as the practice we know today, and its founding by Dr. James Marion Sims, who experimented fiercely and avidly on enslaved women and their daughters. And so when we see that gynecology, a practice of medicine, which is highly revered, respected, used today, and its inception rooted in racist experimentation and white supremacy, we can begin to understand the historical tension and mistrust between the Black and the medical community. I think it's especially important to recognize that biomedical warfare and medical racism has been tethered to American medical society in modern times with things like the Tuskegee experiments, with things like how we handle the HIV and AIDS epidemic, with things like how we handle cancer, with things like how we patent diseases, and the ways in which we can medicate folks because of our patents on those diseases, and the right for different countries to use certain medicines to treat folks with those diseases. It is all very rooted in capitalism, white supremacy, racism, and slavery. And so we can begin to understand with that framework why there's a mistrust still to this day between those communities. And then we can tap into the other communities also. But when you talk about intersectionality, and you talk about the basis of Kimberly Crenshaw coining that concept, you have to go deeper into what the concept is and what information it borrows from. And so Black feminist thought provided the concept knowledge for intersectionality. Patricia Hill Collins talks about the matrix of domination. She talks about race, class, sex/gender being the means in which we are dominated. Bell Hooks talks about this matrix as the politic of domination, right? And so race, class, gender, or sex have been the means in which we have categorized and decided or labeled as inferior or superior historically. And so that matrix of domination was used and created and fostered to benefit those who created and founded modern medicine as we know it. And we are still living within the confines of that matrix today.
Thank you, Vanity. And Rebby, I have seen your head nod so many times. I just want to point that, do you have something to add to this?
I do not.
Okay. It's just, are those nods of agreement then?
full support, and that's just kind of the whole point, is like continue listening in, and I will share when it's time for me to share, and I just uplift everything that's been shared so far.
Okay.
Can I just point out one quick thing that's just because we're speaking truth, and it's for me the umbrella. You know, when we're talking about like disparities and you know, how do people feel with their intersectionalities and everything, and Vanity, you really brought up something that I think more people need to know about in terms of, you know, how modern medicine really kind of has come to where it is. And we're all sitting here speaking, you know, because of Duke. And Duke has this very wonderful prominent name. And Duke has a wealth of financial resources and everything. And Duke was built by slaves. I'm like, you know, a few hundred years ago, my ancestors made Duke what it is today. And yet I am only graciously able to benefit slightly from that. And I, you know, it's like, do I feel like modern, you know, what kind of problems and everything do I face? And I'm like, I'm supposed to go into a hospital that my ancestors, you know, funded on their backs.
Right. Yeah, at what cost? At what cost is it truly a benefit? when you think about the grand scheme, when you think about the historical context of who you are and the many past lives of who you were, and at what cost is it truly beneficial to who you are and who you will continue to be generations later.
I'm sorry, I had to point that out.
I think that's a very important point. Roxana, I wanted to invite you in on
Yes.
this.
So I wanted to basically add, I have a lot of stuff to add in top of my friends here says. I'm gonna say the Latinx community transgender are feeling the same way. They are not treating the right way when they're trying to go and get like health benefits. Why? One of the first mistakes clinics and hospitals are making with the Latinx community is that a transgender woman doesn't identify with their legal name as it's writing on their birth certificate. They always choose a different name because that's how they feel. That's how they want to go with that name. So that they always, and I'm telling you this because I help my new participants of my group. I take every time to get hormone therapy. They always, by the nurses, they always get called by the legal name, and that has to change. That's very rude of nurses being calling patients by the legal names. And that's one of the things it has to change. Really, it has to change. Because I don't see the reason why a lot of clinics around the Triangle area are taking these notes just to make them comfortable calling by the name they want to go by. But they're still missing it. They're not doing anything to make that happen, to make them to be more comfortable in the health areas. And I remember I was there last year before the pandemic starts, and I was taking this girl with me, and her name is Vanessa, and her legal name was, I think, Jose. Well, the nurse came out and he's like, Jose. And I was like, I feel so bad that I came to the front desk and talked to the lady, and I told her that has to change. You guys have to improve the treatment to the patients because this is not fair. And I do feel the same way as Vanity and Cox was saying, because I think a lot of things has to change, but they're not happening. And we wanted to have better services for the transgender community, no matter if they're Black, they're Latin, Hispanic, we need to have better services. Because I remember 2 years ago, I took a trip to San Francisco, California. The services up there are so great. They're so great. The girls, they also getting like free surgeries, like breast implants, sex vaccination, everything. They got like free surgeries up there. And I don't understand why we cannot have stuff like this here in North Carolina for our community.
I think I want to really validate the perspectives of each person who has spoken. It's very, very important to recognize the perspective that you feel when you walk into a clinic, whether it matters, the greeting you receive, the name that you're called at the door, the structural racism that is literally built into the buildings, the hospitals, the clinics, the fact that our institutions, our entire nation was built on the backs of slaves. It's important that we recognize that when we ask patients to come into our clinical environment, that we're asking them to trust us. And in many ways, we're offering them in exchange really just demonstrated centuries of medical abuse upon the Black and brown bodies. It's a very challenging dynamic, and there's nothing that I can say that can negate or change those perspectives. It's really important to uplift them, and I thank each of you for sharing those thoughts. As a clinician, I work in healthcare, and I also see those things as a patient too. I've worked clinically in Atlanta, here in the Triangle. I did clinical rotations in Los Angeles and in San Francisco, and then I've also been a patient in New York City. And I'll say that sometimes these encounters are better in other cities, and sometimes they are not. Just as patients are misgendered by name and by pronoun here occasionally at Duke, I still saw that in Los Angeles, and I still saw that at places in San Francisco. And it's always stinging and it's always burning. And I think that, you know, the racist presuppositions that clinical staff have, you know, hearing, Candace, your words about when a clinical person asks you if you have insurance rather than for your card. These are the types of interactions, the types of microaggressions that people encounter every single day in our clinical environment. And we can't make any headway on addressing misinformation and mistrust unless we're able to actually meet people at the door with acknowledgements of our complicity in the structural racism that oppresses so many. These are linked problems, and I think that it's not unique to the Triangle. I think we see these across the United States as well.
Thank you, Holly. Yeah, so I'm thinking about where to go from here. I'm just so grateful for your willingness to speak truth to your experiences, and I'm wondering, thinking about the microaggressions. You know, we've talked about how many different types of microaggressions and how, and you know, just from this conversation, I'm thinking, my goodness, like, how could there not be mistrust towards the medical system? And really thinking about all of the really macro level changes that need to happen to address, or at least, you know, it's almost hard to be hopeful that there will be such a significant change. And I think we can do our best to try and mitigate some of these things that you all are, especially the things that we can change, at least.
Can we ask Sam, Candace, Vanity, Rebbe, Roxana, can you, what changes do you think that you would like to see or that can make impact in these situations? What can be done?
For the Hispanic community, I would like to see something like do the right pronouns for hers. At least to call, when they call their names, to call them by the name they want to go by. And maybe have the nurses training people, get the training for the nurses. Because I'm also went into situation, and this is separately for the health issues. Transgender Hispanic are getting mistreated in work areas. And we as an organization, as El Centro Hispano, have the LGBT support groups. We have been coming to different places to train employees how to treat LGBTQ people that are working there. So I know it's hard. It's hard for everybody to do it. But for me, at least in hospitals and clinics, they need to start calling patients by their names. and by the names they want to go by. And I think that's, for me, that's basically one of my main points for the clinics.
I feel like that is the least we could do.
Yeah, and I think like
respect.
Respect is huge.
Oh, sorry, Sam. Sorry.
Go ahead, Candace. No, you can go ahead. I'll go after you. You're good.
So, for me, something that I think, especially for trans Black women and trans Latinx women, especially too, is respect. You know, it's really easy to transition when you have access and you have money. And it's easy to respect that. But imagine having to do whatever you possibly could to be who you were, and to have to engage in survival sex work. It's not called prostitution, it's called survival. It means that you are the kind of person who is willing to do whatever it takes in this world for you to be who you are and to take care of yourself. I mean, that is the fundamental of being American that we respect so much within people. And yet so often within my community, I see it as being something that is frowned upon, that is looked down upon. You know, we look at them and we say like, oh, drugs, you know, like they're using drugs and everything. And I'm like, yeah, they're self-medicating because they can't afford your medicine. You know, so respecting that and recognizing that, like, stop putting labels on things and stop making people feel like there's something wrong with them because they're simply trying to survive in a world that they didn't create. They didn't make this world. They didn't make these rules, you know. Trust me, if we know what happened, if I could like actually write legislation in North Carolina, it'd be a completely different state, you know, but I'm here. We're here just trying to survive. And when we go into clinics, every single aspect of who we are is a negative and a mark against us. And it is something for someone to look down their nose upon at us. And I'm like, that's got to stop. When we come in, I'm like, be proud, because it takes more courage than I think people ever will realize to hold your head up high and step outside of your house and be Black and a trans woman or Latinx trans woman, you know, and survive in this world right now that we live in. Like, whatever brought them into your clinic, however they got there, applaud it, support it. Because they're going through, I mean, the journey from their home to your clinic is one that you cannot fathom what they have gone through just to be there and to be who they are. Like, yeah. Sorry.
Candace, I just want to give you so many snaps, Candace, because that's so real. And I think, like, the question I would want to see training on the part of like hospitals and clinics, but like a better form of training. Like, I feel like I have a partner right now who is in her first year of medical residency. And they, and it's in North Carolina. And so they went to 2 days of Racial Equity Institute training, which is great as a starting point, but I feel like it's their ending point as well. And it's not enough to just have like a block of time, 1 or 2 days to say, we're going to talk about racism and how that shows up in our workplace and how we can stop it. And we're going to talk about transphobia and homophobia and how that shows up, intersectionality. Even if you talk about all of that at some point with everyone who's working in the clinics and the hospitals, that's not enough for them to learn it and internalize it. Because like in learning and internalizing the concepts of like Racial Equity Institute and like anti-transphobia, anti-homophobia training, you're also unlearning decades of what society has told you subconsciously and out loud about who deserves to exist and live and get medical access in this world. And that unlearning process is very difficult for adults. I spent 4 years managing adult teachers, and it is very difficult once you get past a certain point to unlearn the things that you've been told in the past and learn new ways of being and operating and moving throughout the world. And I feel like it needs to be a regular, ongoing form of training so that like nurses and hospital staff know, like, okay, we're going to look for pronouns on this chart. We're going to look for the preferred name on this chart. And that's what we're going to utilize with this person. And we are going to use like a standard, even with the microaggressions, a standard way of asking for insurance across the board. And be very intentional about it, not differing based on the color of who you're facing. I just feel like a lot more training and learning needs to be done, especially someplace like Duke that has so much money. Like, why isn't more of it being spent on training around these best practices?
And it's an educational institute.
It is, but when you're talking about that education, I'm fortunate that I'm credentialed and accredited and published, but the people that we're talking about that need so much are the people that are never given the opportunity to do an in-service at a clinic. Bring those people in. Value, the fact that, okay, they're not going to come in with a degree and a PowerPoint and an organization that has backed them, but they're honestly the ones that you need to be listening to. They're the ones that can school you. They can teach you so much more than someone who, such as myself, who, as strange as it is to say, I have a bit of privilege compared to my brothers and sisters, and so I can tell you about their stories, but I can't completely relate. You need to invest in actually educating yourselves on the people that you want to serve. And the only way to do that is, you got to get it from the fish's mouth.
And that part is so important, and to acknowledge that even in the space, like as a BIPOC panel, having white moderators says something very specific about what's showing up in the system at large. And to think about, if the question is what needs to change, it's the same conversation we're having outside of the medical industry. It's across the whole nation. Everything has to change. And if the system continues to reinforce cis heteronormativity, then it will never serve any of these panelists here the way that it ought to, and the way that it continues to prioritize white cis bodies, and particularly men. And we have to unpack that in a way where we give up pity. Like, I'm not asking for pity, I'm asking for the system to change and to be different. And so we have to give up, like, if anybody out there is watching this and like feeling like the sad and the guilt and the pity, okay, cool, process that and then do something. Like, go talk, because I'm not asking anybody to feel bad. And that's happening across the board with this concept of allyship. And like, we're asking for co-conspirators to actually challenge the system and do something completely different. And so until we can have a BIPOC panel that is led by a Black trans person from within the system, there will be forever mistrust.
Yeah, I think Rebby just really outlined the difference between allyship theater and co-conspiratorship. Very two distinct things, two whole different types of functions when it comes to liberative work and then standing in solidarity. But one thing that I feel like definitely needs to change, and this relates to research hospitals specifically, Coming from Charleston, South Carolina, I dealt with the Medical University of South Carolina, which was the premier research institution in the state of South Carolina. One of the practices that research institutions tend to have in place is the supervising or the visiting in or shadowing, if you will, of residents to care providers on their client visits, which can be very detrimental. It can be dehumanizing, and it can strip the dignity of the client who's there to all of a sudden have a resident student who has no expertise in HIV or AIDS management or transgender existence to suddenly be shadowing your doctor and on your medical visit where you talk about all of the intricacies there are to discuss about yourself and your body. Medical universities, research universities have a tendency to allow that to happen. And the cultural competency that needs to go along, the training that we're talking about that needs to go along, deciding when it's appropriate to bring a resident student in to shadow an office visit, I think is something that definitely needs to be revised in order for this demographic to be benefited.
That's such a good point. I'm Don Taylor. Don is bringing in a question that from, I don't know if you all can see this in the chat panel from thank you all so much for your knowledge, expertise, and compassion. I'm honored to be listening to this call. I'm a white nursing student at Duke. We are taught to go into the patient room and ask a set of questions to establish how someone is doing. For example, we asked a lot of questions about pain, location scale from 0 to 10, duration, and also if someone has a pain goal. Would it be appropriate, helpful, beneficial to ask something along the lines of, have you experienced discrimination since coming here? And if so, how can I help with that?
It's too late to wait until they're in the waiting room to ask that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really tough one, you know, because it's, on the one hand, yes, I think it's good to show that care, but on the other hand, are you likely to get a authentic answer? No, because what is going through my mind is motive. Why are you asking? You know, why are you asking? And like now, you know, because like Rebe was saying, like, so I've gone through all of it, and now you're asking, like, why didn't the receptionist ask me?
Yeah.
Like,
Yes,
like,
exactly. Yes.
you know, so now I'm questioning, like, well, why are you asking? Like, all of a sudden, you know. But on the other hand, yes, I think it's important because that trauma that someone experiences from discrimination, when we're talking about on a scale of 0 to 10, tell me about your pain. You know, my foot is hurting. The discrimination I've experienced has exacerbated that. You know, it's like, and we know from a medical standpoint that literally is possible because, you know, all the release of all of those hormones and everything and everything that kind of takes place within a person when they're feeling attacked or whatever or defensive can make it worse. So yes, but I think that we need to address that earlier on in the interaction with the patient.
I think it has to be done in the reception area, something like that.
Yeah.
And that,
Well,
that
I think
question
like
needs
even
to get
if
asked up. Go for it.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, even if it was a helpful response or question to ask, the amount of help would be limited to like on an individual level when so many of these issues and challenges are structural and systemic. So I think you have to just be very aware of like what the actual long-term goal is, like equitable treatment across the board, and what are actions that can be taken towards that big picture goal.
And
yeah,
something
and asking us, it's just it's it's going to be difficult for us to answer. You know, Latinx and Black people especially,
Yes.
we live every single day with so much discrimination that if you ask me, have you been discriminated against today? I'd be like, no. Well, I mean, probably, but like, I can't sit here and like rattle off, like if I, you know, it's like, just give me my medicine. You know, it's like, we have just learned to navigate life and society with discrimination. Like we're so accustomed to it that we don't really see much of a point of saying something to someone because we're like, what's going to happen? Nothing.
And this goes back to what Candace was saying earlier too, that if my medical professional is asking me these basic questions that don't reflect a diverse gender expression and experience, then how can I even think that this particular institution is also going to have an equity lens around race, to where the person who's asking that question should have had training, should have been able to have an institutional picture to know and to create different questions and different data sets that I can come into a room and I know that that professional is already going to have a lens into that and create some space, but it doesn't. It's still catering to people who do not experience discrimination and have proximity to power as they navigate that system. And so that's the true question, is that question has to go back up and say, why do we continue to choose operating the system in this way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Ravi, I think it was in your training that one of the definitions of privilege that has stuck with me is the proximity to power and resources, and that has definitely changed the way I've been thinking about a lot of things in our work in the health system. So I thank you for that. And I know that I think Holly had a question that she was going to ask.
Oh, I wanted to ask all the folks how the COVID era and the quarantine and the ongoing pandemic has exacerbated these issues for each of these concerns.
I don't even know where to begin with that. I mean, COVID has really just trans, femme identified, queer people of color, all of them they're going to be the demographic that we need to really be paying close attention to their survival in the time frame, because we have taken away so much of their ability to survive, you know, and we have forced them to be exposed to COVID, but also increased their exposure to other things that can affect their health and their life. You know, if you're a drag queen and that's how you make your money, and that's wonderful, but we've taken that away from you, and you can't get unemployment, you can't get those services. And if you engage in survival sex work, it's called survival sex work. And COVID is not going to really change that. So, you know, it's really kind of addressing the fact that we have an institution in this country that, you know, makes it so that we can talk all day long about exposure and, you know, quarantining and all of that. But that for some people, it's a moot point, you know. It's like they're not talking about all that stuff. They're just trying to survive, you know. Let's keep it real. If you live in a motel on Capitol Boulevard in Raleigh, they charge by the week. You got to make that money. You got to come up with it. And COVID or not COVID, you're going to do it. And there's no resources. You know, what resources are there? You go to a church, like, and explain yourself and get help with what? Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that. I'm sorry. I'll shut up. I'll totally let someone else, because
I want to say something about it. I'm gonna say probably with this, during this pandemic, I remember when we go to quarantine, I was basically connecting with my participants over Zoom or either individual phone calls. And I'll be honest, what I was listening from them, it was frustration. They were feeling bad to be sitting at home, either because they lost their jobs. And I think they were needing to have some mental health. And we were not having anything of that available at that time. And people that were planning on doing mental health for participants or people around transgender community, they were charging a lot of money. Like, they think there was like the advantage to take and just make money off of it. And I think that was not fair to do. So we need to start having also like a mental health support group in the area where we can just basically call and they will be there to give the support to the community, because the community, they do need the support, especially in times like this. This is something that we need, not something that is going to be, doctors are going to be making money off of it.
speak on it. And I'm going to call Dane out on that, because I'm going to be like, speak on it. And Dane, I'm like, that's you. You're
Yeah.
like, free clinic.
Yeah. Well, and this is something that I'm wanting to ask, because, you know, even though we're all on a Zoom platform right now, if we weren't, the invitation would be to come to Duke, right, and talk about this. And I'm wondering, like, hearing from what Roxana is saying, and and quite frankly, after hearing just these horrific descriptions of the experiences I've had of coming here, like, is a way of could a way of building back trust being going out of Duke to speak to people? Yeah. And is that, you know, because I feel like asking people to come to Duke creates a lot of other burdens and costs, parking, and then you know, everything that comes in walking through the door, and then the whole time you're there.
Yeah, create neutral ground. Go to El Centro Hispano, you know, and go to the LGBTQ Center of Durham. Go to where they're at. Like, I think that neutral ground, you know, goes a long way.
Yeah, because just to like second what has been said, even just like thinking about the experience of coming to Duke, like, I'm a student at Duke, and I spoke on a panel at Duke last year, and I just couldn't stop thinking about the audience who I was speaking to and how much privilege was within the audience that I was speaking to, and like how it felt like me being a Black trans person of low means financially in the world was just like on a platform to educate these like more privileged, predominantly cis, predominantly white people. And it just felt like another form of Black and trans people not getting paid for their worth. Black and brown trans people not getting paid for their worth.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. And I'm, yeah, so and there's a question, how do y'all feel about questions being asked about, one, what were your gender at birth, and two, what gender do you identify with now?
I have some thoughts on that, just because again, from being hospitalized in the past, like I've had experiences of talking to nurses who called me like young lady, and I would tell them like I'm not a young lady, and they would be like, oh, you're just like confused, or you're just sick right now, but like you'll come around. And it's like experiences like that really have me thinking about, well, experiences like that and experiences like with weight, because according to like the BMI, I am overweight, and that comes up in a lot of conversations with like my primary care physician. And I'm always like, what is the purpose of this? Like, towards what ends are you asking these questions about gender? Towards what ends are you asking these questions about weight? Like, what are you trying to accomplish? Because a lot of times I feel like, at least in my experience, I've been asked questions about gender for no reason. And so I, didn't have a gender at birth. And B, now you're asking me to just re-invoke for you what some cis white dude doctor assigned me when I came out of the womb, which I had no say or voice in at all. So it's that first question of what gender you were at birth. I would really wonder about like the purpose of that question, and even like your current gender. Like, I think that gender can be something that people live out loud, and it can also be something that's like personal to people. So if there's not a very specific and important goal you're trying to reach through those questions, I'd wonder about asking them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm agree with that
I
too.
think yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm agree with that too, because to be honest, for me, reading that question, what was your gender when you were at birth? For me, I'll be honest, it sounds offensive. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you think, Candix.
I mean, like, just like, what was your gender at birth? And I'm like,
yes.
Are you clocking my tea or something? Like, are you trying to say like I look like a woman, but you think I might not have been born a woman? So are you asking, am I transgender or am I Serena Williams? Like, it's, you know, but so for me, it's I think it's okay to ask that, with the caveat that first you explain why you're going to ask certain questions.
Yes.
And the reason you explain is you educate. So you educate, because that's what you're here to do, is you want me to, you're a doctor, you're not a funeral home director, you're a nurse, you know, you're not someone who's working in, you know, a crematorium. So you're here to help me live. And if you're asking because you need to find out whether or not I still have a prostate, because I'm over the age of 40, if I still have a prostate, I need to be receiving a prostate exam because of prostate cancer. Now I am okay telling you, because you're not asking for anything other than, I respect you as the woman that you are. I see you as the woman that you are. I want to help you live as long a healthy life as the person who you are. That just means I need to address certain things. If it's the opposite, you know, do you have, you know, are we getting to where it's like do you still have your, mammary glands and breast tissue? And do we need to do examinations for breast cancer? So establishing the context of the question first and expressing the care that's behind it, because otherwise I think it kind of really speaks to what you were just saying, where it's like, why are you asking? You need to establish that care and that sensitivity first, so that I'm not questioning your motive. And I think that's really true with any questions when we're dealing with sensitive topics, is you need to establish that level of care and sensitivity so that I don't question your motive.
And just to bring that up, I have to tell you, LGBT community is so sensitive with questions like this.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be so very careful on which way we're gonna do it, because especially me working as a coordinator for the centris panel, I've been seeing it a lot. The community always asks me like, what are they asking me these questions? Why do they want to know this? Why do they want to know that? So we have to be very careful how we're going to be asking stuff, especially going through the people, because we don't know, you guys don't know how that person might react back to you guys.
Yeah, just to reiterate also, want to be on the note of being particular and careful with the language we're using. We should be asking the questions of, if it comes to that, the sex assigned at birth, because the gender and the gender expression is something that's going to be socialized. And so at birth, you have not yet been socialized. So we want to make sure that we're speaking about sex assigned at birth, not gender.
And I'm one thing that I think is, yes, vanity. I think that's absolutely right, and it. I'm hearing too about like one, and correct me if I'm wrong or not getting this, but one way to at least reduce mistrust would be to explain why you're asking a question about someone's about gender or about anything during an appointment, because of, and that's a result of the trauma that has already been experienced, because there's already like a threat response, and I can't remember exactly who it was, but when someone sees a white coat, it's like, kind of that's a threat cue, which that's, wow, yeah, and I can totally see why. But I've been thinking about like explaining why someone is asking and having that, and making sure that it's a good reason. Like, they're coming in for an earache, there are questions that don't need to be asked about all these things. Yeah,
we call that the transgender elbow syndrome, which is when someone comes to the emergency department with a broken arm, and they broke their arm, and maybe they fell off the bike or something, but suddenly all the questions that are asked relate to that person's genitalia and what they were born with, what they were not born with. Could this be a factor? Maybe the hormones made it more likely for their bones to break, et cetera, et cetera. When in reality, they just fell off their bike and broke their arm. And their gender expression or identity doesn't necessarily have anything to do with their arm. So let's just focus on the patient's arm, which is something that's often lost.
And I think right now with everything that we're seeing happening to people of color, not just queer, but people of color, it is something that I think healthcare providers have to accept, that in terms of posing a threat, it's like police, healthcare, government, all are equally something that poses a threat right now to people of color. And for people of color, that's very palpable, you know, and it's, so that guard is going to be there and asking me to be vulnerable and asking me to disclose more and more, really kind of, it's like, what's going to be the next question? Where are we going to stop? Wait, you know, how far are you going to go? Are you going to ask my my citizenship status? Are you going to ask about my genitalia? Are you going to ask about STDs that are, you know, it's like, how far are you going to go? And then when am I going to get hurt? Because we are hurt. And, you know, for people of color right now in this country, I think that everything has shown us that it isn't in the dark alleyways with the skinheads who are hurting us. It's the people in uniforms. It's the people who are supposed to, you know, be the ones that we go to for help. And they're the ones who are hurting us right now.
Betrayal. And you said something about vulnerability, and I've been put on my like psychologist hat for a minute, and kind of like the recipe for trust that I had always like thought about is that it's safety plus vulnerability is what equals trust. And if as a medical system we are not keeping you safe when you are at your most vulnerable, then that is why would we expect for there to be any trust there? So, and I know that, go please, Sam.
Sorry, I know we're running out of time, but I just really quickly wanted to say that somebody in the chat had mentioned that I actually met her at the previous panel that I just spoke about. And we were talking about the importance of like follow-up or next steps and actions after different panels and meetings and sessions like the one we're having today, towards a point of being able to say like, okay, we did this thing and we actually are gonna hopefully see some changes in these areas because of it, as opposed to like we all got together for a brief moment in time and that was really good and affirming, but now it's over. So that just makes me wonder if there are any plans for follow-up or, you know, like next steps coming out of today's session.
That is what I was hoping we could close on, is you know, thinking about what would be the best way to proceed from here. I heard maybe going out into the community meeting in a different place. And what do you have any ideas about how we can take action and try to address some of these systemic issues?
Community clinics. Like that is like community clinics that address our specific needs, but then also our general human needs. So COVID testing, but also HRT, or, you know, resources about free access to HRT or surgery. Community clinics, like address our health, our mental health, our physical health, our transitions, our identity, our sense of self, our sense of security. Yeah, and make it accessible. I think that is an action item. Like I would love to see you all email me and tell me about the Duke sponsored sessions that, you know, community clinics that are going to be taking place at El Centro Hispano, it's right down the street from you. And, you know, partnering with Equality NC, and they will help you find a physical location. I'm speaking these things into existence and calling it out because this is being recorded. So that's what I'm looking for. Otherwise, Duke can keep the money. You know, I love you all personally, but I'm just keeping it real. I'm like, yeah, this talking, I love all these people up here. I can talk to them offline. when I don't have to worry about, wearing, this cute blazer that I picked up. But yeah, action items, like seriously, do something and do it now. If they're not giving you the money, okay, you have a medical license. You have a brain. Offer yourself. That's just mine.
I love
I'm
Candace.
sorry.
I love Candace. You're so eloquent with like the way that you like just can describe something in such a poignant, powerful way. It's a gift. I wish I was that that gift. For the rest of the panelists, do you have any other ideas? We're at 12 o'clock and I don't want to, we have one more speaker. So any other closing thoughts, ideas?
I would just like to hear about some of the different ways that you and Dr. Lewis both feel like you are troubling the system that we're currently within, like, I don't know, even if it's like a newsletter or something that comes out like once a month or something, but like something that shows like in an ongoing way that work is actively being done to change some of the structures that we are currently having to struggle to try to exist within.
I think I can commit to that for sure. I think it would also be great to have like a community advisory. We have a community advisory board, but maybe one that is that we can do. Yeah, that's more specific to this. I think there's some very unique needs with this particular like intersecting group. So we can hyper focus on this.
These perspectives are really so important. It reminds us of like the importance of getting outside of the Duke community and actually engaging with people and meeting folks where they're at. I know I would love to be a part of an initiative that actually goes to a place like Centro Hispano or a program that actually leaves this like protected little space of Duke and is actually working in an active way, like Rebby said, as like co-conspirators for justice in these different aspects, because I realize that as much as we do in these little clinical environments, it's important, not the work that we're all trying to do matters outside of this like small square mile of space. So I know that I will definitely be open to and looking for opportunities to try to extend this work and beyond just our Duke little bubble, but actually getting involved in other institutions. I've been to the LGBT Center of Durham when I first moved here and went to some programming there. And there's a lot of important initiatives. Even though we're in the Zoom era, it's so hard to travel. I think little things like bringing COVID testing out into the community is so important. We have a COVID testing center that's a drive-up facility here at Duke, but it's here at Duke. I think we need to have those resources in a more disparate fashion so that people can get to them. Little changes like that and meeting folks where they're at is going to be an important part of our systemic response.
I would like to see a potential consortium or cooperative effort between the research institute that helped sponsor this event, the many organizations that are here represented present today, and a formal community needs assessment on the intersectionality that we were discussing today. When we talk about EDIC and EMIC perspectives, EMIC being from within the community, EDIC being outside looking in terms of sociology and anthropology, it's important to really drive in on the EMIC perspectives. And so we can somehow draft, formulate, propose a formal research proposal collaboratively between some of the organizations here and the research institutes that help sponsor this discussion at Duke for a formal community needs assessment. I feel like we can begin to really address some of the intersecting issues.
Thank you, Randy. I love that idea, and I'm sure we will be talking with the directors of the institutes afterwards about next steps. I just want to thank you all for your genuine openness, honesty, and presence, and glamour, and overall fabulousness. I just love it. It's giving me life. And I feel honored that you all were willing to, I think Don Taylor said that this did not come without a cost to each of you and sharing these vulnerable things. And I want to acknowledge that as well and say thank you. And I hope that, I'm committed. I'm going to say I'm committed to making the next steps to solve some of the issues that have been brought to light here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
And I believe we have our closing comments by Dr. Rosa Gonzalez Guarda.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. And I believe that my video has been disabled. So hopefully we can figure that piece out soon, so I can join you here in this. Oh, there we go. Hello, everyone. So before I share some of my thoughts, I just wanted to, again, mimic what and emphasize what Dr. Wicker said in terms of expressing my gratitude for sharing what is, particularly vulnerable experiences with us. And I think it's ironic that the name of this session is really focusing on mistrust and misinformation, and that you all the panelists, and particularly this last one, really did place a great deal of trust in us in sharing their experiences. And it's something for us to take serious, because with that trust is a great deal of responsibility in what we do with information and vulnerabilities that were shared with us, in translating that into change and to action. To continue with some of my ideas, I just want to say that it is an incredible honor for me to be here with you all this morning and what has turned into an afternoon. And it's also an incredibly daunting task to try to think through some of the major themes that I've heard and really give praise to the incredible information and lived experiences that have been shared with all of us. So my name is Rosa Gonzalez Guarda, and I am an associate professor at Duke University School of Nursing. And one of the roles that I have there is that I lead our population health research efforts for the school. And I also have a role in our CTSI, or Clinical Science Translational Institute, where I'm one of a few co-directors of our Community Engaged Research Initiative, where we really try hard, and we continually need to do a better job at this, of really facilitating community academic partnerships around research that is meaningful and responsive to the needs and priorities of the very diverse communities that we are here to serve. I'm also the principal investigator of the Ser Hispano study, which is a study of stress and resilience in the Latinx immigrant community. And I have the wonderful fortune of being able to partner with El Centro Hispano, and Pilar Rocha Goldberg, who you all heard from earlier today, is one of the co-investigators on our study. And we have staff from El Centro that are really key in our research efforts. So that's sort of the frame that I have in terms of my experiences and the different hats that I wear that will shape some of my comments. And what I would like to do is just go through this morning and highlight some of the themes that I noted across the sessions. And then I wanted to share some of the exciting things that we're doing in the CTSI and at Duke more broadly to address some of these issues. And then finally close off with some things that I think that we can do in terms of actions that result from this. So just starting from the beginning today, I want to just highlight the issue and really the stark reminder of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's disproportionately impacted communities of color and underrepresented groups in research. And from the talks that we've learned early this on in the morning is the realization that COVID-19 is really rooted in structural and systemic racism. And in terms of thinking how to solve that, we're gonna need to have new tools in our toolbox where while we're investing all this money in vaccine development, we're going to equally or more so need to invest money in really addressing the social root causes of this pandemic. And I think that, you know, one of the orientations I take in my research is a syndemic orientation, which considers co-occurring epidemics or co-occurring pandemics and tries to understand why do these cluster in certain populations. And they cluster for many reasons that we talked about this morning, really being rooted in racism, xenophobia, and white supremacy. So in our race to develop a vaccine, we have to invest even more resources in our race to address these fundamental causes of these conditions. And in the second, well, in the first session after this keynote, we really started hearing about some of the potential ways that we can go about doing that. And really fundamental to us addressing the reasons for trust or mistrust or distrust in the community is really thinking about relationships and relationship building as an antidote to some of the problems that we're seeing. And really in that session, the idea that was highlighted most, or one of the ideas that was highlighted most for me, was the idea around the importance of listening and being humble. And that's something we certainly carried out through in this last session that we heard. And then the other thing about that listening and being humble is really listening, not just for the listening's sake, but having action that results from that. And if listening isn't preceded with action, then I think we have the potential to exacerbate a lot of the mistrust that is already existing in our community. In the session 2, we learned a lot from the lived experiences of the participants of that panel. And one of the things that was striking to me is in thinking of intersectionality, the intersecting streets of race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation. We heard about the experience of, we opened talking about what are some bad experiences that you've had, and the realization that almost every experience is an undesirable experience or an unpleasant experience when you come from it from these intersecting identities, and when the systems that are there to serve are not really inclusive of those intersecting identities. So in terms of thinking through of some of the things that we're doing at Duke and in the community that I think are promising, I like to just raise this new relationship that has really been in development and enhanced between the Social Science Research Institute and the Duke CTSI. It really speaks to the recognition of our health system and infrastructure that in order to make advancements in population health, we're going to need to address the social drivers. I'm also excited and want to share that our new Clinical Translational Science Institute, our new application is really focused on issues of disparities, inclusion, and racial equity. And we have, one of the main themes is around accountability, transparency, and trustworthiness of research to enhance equity and trust. We have a new core within that group and you saw a lot of representatives here in the discussion today, which is the Equity and Research Core, with Dane Wicker, Keisha Bentley Edwards, who's participating also, and Nadine Barrett as co-leaders of that. As part of that, there's a trust survey that we're going to be launching to be able to identify some of the issues around trust and mistrust, as well as generate ideas of what we need to do in order to advance that. And I just posted in the chat an activity that we're going to be having, a virtual dialogue to get ideas of how to best design that work so that we really get the kind of information that we can act on. And then the other thing that I think that is happening organically in our community, which speaks to our need to really go outside of the walls of Duke and really invest in the wonderful, awesome work that is happening in our communities, is that we're seeing a number of coalitions coming together to address issues of importance for underrepresented groups and groups that are most affected by COVID-19. I happen to be part of the Latin 19 group, which is a multi-stakeholder group that has come together to address issues unique to the Latinx community. And one of the things that had been really rewarding as part of the work in that group is the ability to connect decision makers, which was a theme I heard today, decision makers that might have that power and privilege with the people who have the know-how, the people who have the lived experience. And that connection has really, and listening has really resulted in actions that have been resolved after a 1-hour phone call. And there's similar groups in the Black community, in the homeless community, and with older adults that are opportunities for all of us to, particularly those of us that are at Duke that need to get outside of Duke to integrate into those things. So I know that we've reached our last, I'm 1 minute over here, so I'll just try to summarize this and be brief in terms of what I think we can do, what else we can do to address this work. First, we need to listen. We need to be humble and continue to listen. We need to ask about what the needs are and the solutions. And Vanity had a great idea about us investing in doing a needs assessment that has this intersectional perspective to be able to capture those identities and the impact that intersecting identities have on health. We need to be engaging folks well before we need anything. Now in the age of COVID-19, where Duke is really trying to get representative samples in COVID-19 research, we've come to the realization that it's really hard because we haven't always done due diligence in investing in the relationships that we need to really develop the trust that will be required for people to be part of the solutions, the research driving these solutions. And then finally, and most importantly, we really need to act. These conversations are really wonderful beginning that need to be followed up with some actions. And today we talked about a number of actions related to the quality and access to healthcare, having comprehensive plans for addressing issues of inclusion and diversity and equity, which include policy, training that's just not just one-shot training, but really comprehensive and repetitive. And then also having some evaluation around that to make sure that it has impact. And then as many have shared, we really need to go outside of the walls of Duke. We have to go into the community organizations that are doing this great work. We've heard from many of them this morning. I just shared with you the COVID specific work groups that are opportunities for us to be integrated. And then in doing that, we really need to make sure that we are linking the power and the privilege to the voices of the lived experience to make that impact. So thank you so much for this morning. I want to thank you all, particularly all the panelists and the participants that made time to listen to these issues and to brainstorm together about possible solutions. I'm really, as despairing some of the the statistics are and the experiences that we've heard this morning, I am also equally optimistic about the potential power that we all have when we pull together to address this as one community. Thank you so much.